A random act of kindness changed my day. A random act of kindness changed my day was how it all started, or at least, how I thought it started, because that morning I had barely managed to drag myself out of bed and into some semblance of a routine. Everything felt off, like the world was playing a cruel joke that only I was in on. My alarm didn't go off, my favorite shirt was wrinkled beyond repair, I spilled coffee on myself just as I was walking out the door. By the time I made it to the coffee shop near work, I was done, absolutely ready to call in sick and crawl back under my covers. But then, as I reached the counter, fumbling through my wallet, I heard a voice beside me say, "It's on me." I looked up to see a stranger, maybe in his 50s, dressed in an old tweed jacket that looked like it had seen better days, smiling at me warmly. Before I could refuse, he handed the cashier a crumpled bill and turned to me with the strangest smile. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze piercing and unblinking. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled a thank you and took my coffee, thinking maybe he was just a lonely man trying to make small talk, but something about his eyes followed me even as I walked out of the shop. At first, I shrugged it off, maybe he was just trying to be friendly, a little eccentric, sure, but harmless. But then, as I went about my day, I couldn't shake his words. It was as if they'd woven themselves into my thoughts, resurfacing at the strangest times, his voice echoing in my mind, "Kindness opens doors." It got stranger when I went into the bathroom at work and saw those exact words, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," written on the mirror in a faint, foggy smudge. I laughed it off, thinking maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe someone else had heard the same line. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the words seemed to haunt me. I started noticing little things. A stranger would smile at me on the subway, or someone would hold the door open just a second too long, staring a little too hard, their expression too intense. The day slipped by in a strange blur of overly kind faces and lingering stares, and by evening, I was starting to feel the weight of it, an itch I couldn't scratch. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the world was pressing in, like every kind act I received had some hidden meaning I couldn't see. It wasn't until I nearly got hit by a car crossing the street that I realized something was really wrong. I hadn't even seen it coming, but just as it barreled toward me, a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me back onto the curb. I turned to thank my rescuer, only to find an old woman smiling at me with the same eerie, knowing expression as the stranger from the coffee shop. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," she whispered before shuffling away, her gaze lingering on me just a second too long. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding as I watched her disappear into the crowd. At that moment, something clicked, a horrifying realization that maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. The phrase echoed in my mind, growing louder, feeding the paranoia creeping into my bones. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was horribly wrong. People started acting different around me, like they knew something I didn't, smiling at me with that same unsettling look, muttering the same words under their breath. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but every time I looked around, there they were, strangers, friends, even my own reflection seemed to watch me with that eerie, knowing gaze. I tried calling friends, tried telling them what was happening, but no one took me seriously, chalking it up to stress or lack of sleep. As night fell, I found myself wandering the streets, desperate to escape the invisible weight pressing down on me. I needed answers, needed to find the stranger from the coffee shop and demand he explain what he'd done to me. Somehow, I knew he was the key to all of this, the only one who could make it stop. After hours of searching, I finally spotted him in a dimly lit cafe, sitting alone at a corner table. I stormed up to him, my hands shaking, demanding to know why he'd said those words, why everyone was repeating them, what he'd done to me. He looked up, his eyes calm and cold, and said, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see, but you must be willing to step through." He didn't say anything more, just smiled that strange, empty smile, and in that moment, I realized with a sickening dread that I'd never be free. I was trapped, a puppet to some twisted kindness I didn't understand, doomed to carry his message, to spread his words, to watch that same madness take root in others. As I left the cafe, I found myself repeating his words to a passing stranger, my voice trembling, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as their face shifted, their eyes clouding over with the same haunted look I'd seen in my own. When my partner and I had our biggest fight, what went wrong? When my partner and I had our biggest fight, what went wrong? It wasn't like we hadn't argued before. In fact, we'd always had what I thought was a passionate relationship. Little disagreements, playful banter that sometimes got heated but would quickly dissolve into laughter or apology, that was us. I thought we had this unbreakable bond, that no matter how bad things got, we'd be able to work through them. But this night was different. I had come home late from work. It was one of those weeks when every project seemed to be falling apart, and I'd barely slept for days. The house was dark when I walked in, the only light coming from the living room where my partner was sitting on the couch, motionless, staring at the floor. I could feel the tension before I even said a word. "Hey," I tried, but they didn't answer, didn't even look up. I could feel something was wrong, but I didn't know why. There had been no recent fights, no simmering issues I could think of, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they spoke. "We need to talk." I hate those 4 words more than anything because nothing good ever follows them. I took a seat across from them, waiting, trying to read their face, but they looked like someone I didn't recognize. They started listing off things that had bothered them, small grievances that seemed to have piled up, little resentments I didn't know they'd been harboring. The way I'd been distant, the times I'd chosen work over them, the moments I hadn't been fully present. I was blindsided. I thought we were fine, I thought we'd been on the same page, but apparently, all of these tiny cracks had been forming under the surface, and I'd been too oblivious to see them. I tried to explain, to tell them that I didn't know, that I hadn't realized they were feeling this way, but it was like trying to talk to a wall. They weren't listening, or maybe they'd already decided that nothing I said would matter. Then they brought up something that happened months ago, something I thought we'd resolved, but apparently, they'd been stewing on it, letting it fester. I felt this surge of anger then, this bitter resentment that they hadn't come to me sooner, hadn't given me a chance to fix things before it got this bad. I snapped. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I raised my voice, told them that I couldn't read their mind, that if something was bothering them, they needed to tell me instead of holding it in and then throwing it in my face months later. It escalated from there, both of us saying things we didn't mean, hurtful words that we could never take back. They told me they'd been unhappy for a long time, that they weren't sure they could do this anymore. And that's when it happened. I felt something shift, like the ground had dropped out from beneath me, like the person sitting across from me was suddenly a stranger. I looked at them, really looked, and for the first time, I saw someone who wasn't my partner, someone who had all these hidden corners and dark places I'd never noticed. It terrified me. I remember getting up, walking to the window, staring out into the night, trying to calm down, trying to think of anything to say that would fix this, but nothing came. And then, as I stood there, I felt something. It's hard to describe, but it was like this icy hand on my shoulder, this cold weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I turned around, but no one was there. My partner was still on the couch, watching me with this strange expression, like they knew something I didn't. "What's wrong?" they asked, but their voice didn't sound right, didn't sound like them. I shook it off, told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the stress of the fight, but as I looked at them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Their eyes looked different, darker somehow, and there was this slight smile, like they were enjoying watching me unravel. "Why are you smiling?" I asked, my voice trembling. They looked confused, like they didn't know what I was talking about, but the smile was still there, faint but unmistakable. That's when the room went cold, colder than I thought possible, and I felt this pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of me. I wanted to leave, to get out of that room, but I couldn't move. My partner started talking again, but the words didn't make sense. They were saying things I'd never told them, secrets I'd kept buried for years, things no one else knew. I tried to speak, to ask them how they knew, but my voice was gone, frozen in my throat. They kept talking, listing off every mistake I'd ever made, every regret, every dark thought I'd ever had, and I could feel myself unraveling, feel my mind slipping. I closed my eyes, told myself to wake up, to snap out of it, but when I opened them, I was alone. The couch was empty, the room silent. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no sign of my partner. I stumbled to the bedroom, calling their name, but the house was empty. I grabbed my phone, called them, but it went straight to voicemail. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had happened, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard the door open, footsteps in the hallway, and my partner walked in, looking normal, looking like nothing had happened. Where were you? I asked, but they looked at me like I was crazy, told me they'd just gone out for a walk to cool off after the fight. I tried to explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt, but they laughed, said I was just stressed, that I'd imagined it. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and every time I look at them now, I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. There's this distance between us, this coldness that wasn't there before, and sometimes, when they think I'm not looking, I catch them staring at me with that same strange smile. I don't know who they are anymore, don't know if they're still the person I fell in love with, or if something else came back with them that night. All I know is that I can't sleep, can't eat, can't think straight. I feel like I'm losing my mind, like whatever I saw that night is still with me, watching, waiting for something. And the worst part? I don't think it's finished with me yet. How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. It was a small thing that first made me wonder, something so insignificant that I almost ignored it. I was cleaning up after dinner when I noticed a strange smell in the kitchen, a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. I searched everywhere, thinking maybe a pipe was leaking or something had spoiled, but I couldn't find the source. My partner, Alex, shrugged it off, saying I was probably just imagining it. But I knew my own home, and I knew that smell hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, more little things started to pile up. Alex would come home later than usual without an explanation, brushing me off when I asked where they'd been. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find them staring at the ceiling, lost in thought, their face tight with something that looked a lot like fear. And then there was the drawer, the one in our bedroom that I'd never been able to open. Alex had told me it was broken, that the key had been lost years ago, and I'd believed them because why wouldn't I? But now, every time I looked at that drawer, I felt this gnawing curiosity, this urge to find out what was inside. One night, while Alex was in the shower, I couldn't resist any longer. I grabbed a hairpin and went to work on the lock, my hands shaking, my heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, there was a click, and the drawer slid open. Inside was a small wooden box, plain and unassuming. But when I opened it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The box was filled with photographs, all of the same person, a woman I didn't recognize. In every picture, she was smiling, but there was something strange about her eyes, something hollow and haunting. There was also a piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, with what looked like an old address scrawled across it. I shoved the box back into the drawer and locked it, my mind racing. Who was this woman? Why did Alex have these pictures, and why hadn't they told me about her? That night, I confronted them, but they just stared at me, expressionless, and said, "You shouldn't have looked." There was a coldness in their voice that I'd never heard before, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. They refused to explain, refused to tell me anything more, and I was left with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, Alex became distant, almost like they were a stranger in our own home. They'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, without telling me where they were going, and when I tried to ask, they'd give me this blank, soulless stare that made my blood run cold. I started to dig, desperate to find answers. I searched through every document, every old photograph, anything that might give me a clue, but it was like Alex had erased their past, like they'd never existed before we met. Then, one night, I decided to go to the address on the paper in the drawer. It was a long drive, out to a part of town I'd never been to before, a rundown house at the end of a dark, narrow street. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, but something drew me inside. The house was empty, silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I wandered through the rooms, my flashlight casting eerie shadows, and that's when I found it, a picture of Alex, taken years ago, with that same woman from the photos. They looked happy, close, almost like a couple. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had Alex been hiding an entire life from me? And if so, why? As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, fear clawing at my throat, but when I turned, no one was there. I ran out of that house as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe in my car. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me with a look of pure hatred. I barely slept that night, haunted by the image of that woman, by the thought of Alex and the secrets they'd kept from me. The next day, I confronted them again, demanded to know the truth. They just laughed, a cold, empty sound that sent shivers down my spine. "She's not gone, you know," they said, their voice barely a whisper. "She's still watching, still waiting." I didn't understand, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the guilt that they couldn't hide. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Alex talking in their sleep, mumbling things I couldn't understand, things that sounded like names, places, memories they'd buried long ago. I started hearing strange noises in the house, whispers in the dark, footsteps that didn't belong to either of us. One night, I woke up to find Alex standing at the foot of the bed, staring down at me with a look of pure hatred, their eyes dark and unrecognizable. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone, trapped in my throat. They leaned down, whispered in my ear, "She's never leaving," and then they walked out of the room, leaving me trembling in the darkness. I don't know what happened to Alex, don't know if they're still the person I fell in love with, or if something darker has taken their place. All I know is that our home doesn't feel like ours anymore, that every time I look at them, I see that woman's face, her hollow eyes staring back at me. And every night, I hear her voice, whispering my name, calling me back to that house, to the secrets I was never meant to uncover. I uncovered a family secret that changes everything. It all began on an ordinary Saturday afternoon while I was cleaning out my late grandmother's attic. My family had recently gathered to mourn her passing, and now it was time to sort through the remnants of her life. The attic was a treasure trove of dusty boxes, old furniture, and forgotten memories, each item telling a story that connected me to my family's history. As I rummaged through the clutter, I stumbled upon a battered old trunk tucked away in a corner, hidden beneath a tattered quilt. Its faded leather exterior was worn and cracked, and the rusty latch creaked as I pried it open, revealing a jumble of old photographs, letters, and various trinkets. Intrigued, I began sifting through the contents, holding each piece of my family's past in my hands. Most of the photographs were familiar, depicting family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays, but there was something off about a few of them. I found a picture of my grandmother, young and radiant, standing next to a man I had never seen before. They were smiling, and there was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't recognized before. I flipped it over, hoping for a name, but it was blank. My curiosity piqued, I dug deeper into the trunk, uncovering letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to my grandmother but written in an elegant, flowing script I didn't recognize. The letters were filled with sentiments of love and longing, but the name at the bottom was unfamiliar. "Derek," it read. Confused, I pulled out more letters, reading snippets that hinted at a forbidden romance. It became clear that these letters were from a man whom my grandmother had loved deeply, but why had I never heard of him? I felt an unsettling sensation creep up my spine as I continued to search through the trunk, discovering a small locket tucked away in a silk pouch. When I opened it, I found a tiny photo of the same man alongside a note, "Forever in my heart, my love." My heart raced as I began to piece things together. Who was this man, and why had he been hidden from our family? My mind was swirling with questions, and I felt an urge to confront my mother about what I had uncovered. Later that evening, after gathering the courage to bring it up, I asked my mom about the trunk and the letters. She grew pale, her eyes widening in shock. "You shouldn't have gone through that," she said, her voice trembling. "There are things in there that are better left buried." Alarm bells rang in my head as I pressed her for details. "Mom, who is Derek? Why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to find her words. "Derek was a part of your grandmother's life that she wanted to forget. It was a mistake she made when she was young." I leaned in closer, desperate for the truth. "What kind of mistake? Did she love him?" My mother looked down, her hands shaking. "Yes, she loved him. But he was married at the time, and when their affair came to light, it tore our family apart. Your grandmother was forced to cut ties with him, and she never spoke of it again." I felt a rush of emotions, swirling confusion, and anger bubbling within me. "So, all these years, she kept this secret. Why didn't you ever tell me?" My mom sighed, defeated. "Because I wanted to protect you from the pain. It was a dark time for our family, and I didn't want to relive it." I stood there, processing the revelation. My grandmother, the sweet woman who had always baked cookies for us and shared stories of family adventures, had a hidden past that altered everything I thought I knew about her. I felt betrayed by the silence that had surrounded this part of our family history. "Does anyone else know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Your aunts and uncles know bits and pieces, but they all agreed to keep it quiet, she confessed. It's a secret that has haunted our family for decades. I could hardly believe it. This was more than just a family secret, it was a legacy of heartbreak and betrayal. I didn't know whether to feel sympathy for my grandmother or anger for her decisions. I felt compelled to uncover more about Derek, the man who had stolen her heart and then vanished from our lives. After our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't finished yet. That night, I delved deeper into research. I spent hours online, searching for any trace of Derek. After a fruitless search, I stumbled upon an old newspaper archive that mentioned a tragic car accident decades ago. The article reported that a man named Derek Reynolds had died in a collision while traveling to a nearby city. The details sent chills down my spine. This man was not only a memory but a ghost that lingered in our family's history. I scoured the article for more details, discovering that he had been a well-liked local artist, someone my grandmother had adored. But why had she never told us? Why had she buried her past so deeply? Overwhelmed by the weight of the revelations, I decided I needed to visit my grandmother's grave. I felt a strong urge to connect with her, to understand the woman I had thought I knew. Standing at her grave, I felt a mix of emotions. I placed the locket and the letters on her tombstone, tears streaming down my face. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, searching for answers in the silence. "Why did you hide this part of yourself from me?" As I stood there, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, as if my grandmother were somehow present, urging me to forgive her. The weight of her secret was heavy, but I began to realize that it had shaped our family in ways I couldn't fully understand. I felt a need to honor her memory, not just as the grandmother I adored but as a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. After my visit, I couldn't help but think about how these revelations would affect my relationship with my family. I decided to gather my aunts and uncles for a family dinner, determined to share what I had learned. When they arrived, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. As we gathered around the table, I shared the story of Derek, the letters, and the hidden truth about our family history. Their faces turned pale, shock evident in their eyes. "We thought that was behind us," my Aunt Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Your grandmother's pain was ours too." The atmosphere shifted, filled with a mixture of anger and grief. "We had no idea how deeply it affected her," my Uncle Tom said, shaking his head. "She carried that burden alone." I felt a sense of responsibility for bringing the truth to light, knowing that it might lead to healing. As the evening went on, we shared our own memories of Grandma, recounting her stories and the way she had brought us all together. I realized that while the past was painful, it didn't have to define us. By uncovering the truth, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. We could finally acknowledge her pain and celebrate her life, flaws and all. The dinner ended with a promise to remember Grandma not just for the secrets she kept but for the love she gave us all. I found solace in knowing that while the truth was difficult, it had brought our family closer together. I left the dinner feeling lighter, ready to face whatever came next. I had uncovered a family secret that changed everything, and in doing so, I discovered the power of love, forgiveness, and the importance of embracing our history, no matter how complicated it may be. Why I refused to help a friend in need, a controversial choice. A few months ago, I was faced with a decision that's haunted me ever since, a choice that still makes my heart race every time I think about it. It was one of those situations where everything inside me was screaming that something was wrong, yet everyone around me insisted I should just go along with it. My friend, Alex, had reached out to me after months of no contact. We'd been close once, best friends even, but he had drifted into a different world, one I couldn't quite reach. His life had spiraled out of control, and he'd become increasingly unpredictable, shutting out everyone who tried to help him. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year, until late one night, my phone lit up with his name, an unexpected message out of the blue. "I need your help," it read, a simple request with no explanation. My first instinct was to brush it off, thinking he was probably up to something reckless, maybe a new scheme that wouldn't end well. But a sense of unease crept in, a feeling I couldn't shake, and despite everything, I found myself messaging him back, asking what was going on. His reply was vague and cryptic, saying he was in trouble, that he couldn't explain everything over text, but he needed me to come to a remote part of town, immediately, no questions asked. I could practically feel the desperation in his words, but something didn't feel right. I asked him where he was, who he was with, and if he was in danger, but his replies were short and evasive. He kept repeating that he couldn't explain over the phone, that it was too risky, but that he really needed me. He was practically begging. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him, asking for an address, but that's when things took a turn. He told me not to tell anyone, to come alone, and to make sure I wasn't followed. It all sounded like some low-budget thriller, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would he be so secretive? Why couldn't he just meet me somewhere public if he needed help? I tried calling him, but each time, he'd decline, only to text me moments later with the same plea for help. At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head. The area he wanted me to come to wasn't exactly known for being safe, especially late at night. It was a rundown part of town, the kind of place where things went unnoticed and people turned a blind eye. I texted him back, telling him I'd only come if he could give me some kind of explanation, something to make sense of the whole thing. His response was chilling, "Just trust me. I don't have anyone else. Please." The words hit me hard, bringing up memories of all the times we'd been there for each other. Part of me felt like I owed him this, like I couldn't turn my back on him. But the fear gnawed at me, a quiet, insistent dread that warned me to stay away. I confided in a mutual friend, hoping for some guidance, but he was just as baffled. He hadn't spoken to Alex in ages either and agreed that the situation seemed sketchy. "If he can't even tell you what's going on, maybe it's better to stay out of it," he said, but I could tell he was conflicted too. We both knew how deep Alex's troubles ran, how he had a way of dragging people down with him. The longer I hesitated, the more messages came pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't leave me hanging. I'm out of options." But every time I typed out a response, I found myself deleting it, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about helping a friend. I felt like I was being drawn into something far darker, something that wouldn't end well for either of us. Eventually, I decided I couldn't go, that whatever trouble he was in, it was beyond what I could handle alone. I told him that he should go to the police if he was in real danger, but his response was angry, almost venomous, as if my refusal was a betrayal. "You think I'd ask the cops for help? You really don't get it, do you?" He accused me of abandoning him, of turning my back when he needed me most. The messages became less like pleas and more like accusations, laced with bitterness and blame. I turned off my phone that night, lying awake in bed, guilt twisting my stomach. The next morning, I learned that he'd been involved in a break-in gone wrong. The news reported that 2 men had been caught on a security camera near a warehouse, both fleeing the scene after an altercation with the guards. Alex's face was there, grainy but recognizable, his expression tense and desperate. They hadn't been caught, and his whereabouts were still unknown. A wave of relief mixed with horror washed over me. If I'd gone, would I have been dragged into that mess? Or worse, would I have been caught up in something even darker? I spent the next few days in a haze of guilt and confusion, torn between regret for abandoning him and a haunting certainty that I'd made the right choice. People in our circle found out, and the backlash was swift. Some said I should have done more, that real friends don't turn their backs. Others whispered that Alex had always been trouble, that it was only a matter of time before he crossed the line. I stopped trying to defend myself, stopped trying to explain the gut feeling I'd had, the dread that told me something was very, very wrong. Weeks went by, and I hadn't heard from him again, though the memory of that night lingered, a constant shadow in the back of my mind. I found myself scanning news reports, always half expecting to see his name again, wondering if he was still out there, angry and betrayed. One night, I received another message from an unknown number. It was Alex, and his words were cold and accusing. "You left me to rot," he wrote. "I'll never forget it." I didn't reply, but the guilt gnawed at me all over again, his words echoing in my mind. Sometimes, I wonder if I made a mistake, if I let fear win over friendship, but then I remember the dread I felt, that gut instinct telling me to stay away. Even now, I'm torn between feeling like I abandoned a friend in need and the overwhelming sense that I avoided something terrible. It's a decision that haunts me, a choice I'll never forget, and one I'm still not sure I'd make any differently if I had the chance. The unlikely friendship that changed my life. It's strange how life works sometimes, how we cross paths with people who seem completely unrelated to us, and yet, they end up changing everything. This story starts with a mistake, a misunderstanding that turned into something far more profound than I could have ever imagined. I'm not sure when I first noticed her. To be honest, I didn't pay much attention to anyone around me at that time. I was going through the motions of life, working long hours, trying to build a career, dealing with the stress that comes with constantly striving to be better than everyone else. That's when I met her. Her name was Kate, and she was nothing like the people I normally surrounded myself with. I remember the first day she came into the office, looking all disheveled and frazzled, like she'd just rolled out of bed and into work. I'd never seen anyone so unkempt and carefree in such a professional environment. Most people would have been mortified, but not Kate. She walked in like she owned the place, with a kind of ease and confidence that I couldn't understand. Her reputation didn't help either. People would whisper about her, always something about how she was a little too quirky or a little too unpredictable. I had heard rumors, but I didn't pay them much attention. I was too busy with my own life, my own ambitions, to care about anyone else. But it was hard to ignore her completely. She had this energy, this contagious enthusiasm that somehow made everything feel lighter when she was around. People were drawn to her, even the most serious, no-nonsense people in the office. I kept my distance. I was never the type to let someone like her into my world. I had goals, things I needed to accomplish, and I didn't want anyone distracting me from that. Besides, I figured someone like Kate wouldn't even care about trying to be friends with someone like me. But then one day, she was assigned to work with me on a project. It wasn't anything major, just a collaboration between departments, but it was enough to force us to interact. At first, it was awkward. She was loud, outgoing, and way more disorganized than anyone I'd ever worked with. I was meticulous, focused on every detail, and I didn't have time for people who didn't take their work as seriously as I did. Yet, as much as I tried to keep things strictly professional, there was something about her that I couldn't quite shake. She didn't let the tension between us linger. She'd crack a joke when things felt too serious, or ask me how my day was going when I seemed particularly stressed. I hated it at first, hated how she'd invade my personal space with her light-hearted questions and her too loud laugh. I was used to keeping my thoughts to myself, not sharing them with anyone. But there she was, pushing me to open up in ways I wasn't prepared for. The turning point came about 2 weeks into the project. I had stayed late at the office, trying to get everything perfect, for the upcoming presentation. It was exhausting, and I could feel myself burning out. Kate had left hours earlier, but I was still there, staring at my screen, trying to force my brain to keep working. Then she came back, out of nowhere, with a huge bag of takeout and 2 cups of coffee. She set everything down on my desk with a wide grin. "You look like you need a break," she said, sitting across from me. I tried to protest, tell her I didn't have time for a break, but she wouldn't hear it. Instead, we sat there, eating our food in silence for a while. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. It wasn't a huge thing, not some grand gesture, but it was enough to make me realize that maybe there was more to life than just work, than just pushing forward without ever looking around. After that day, something shifted. Kate and I started talking more, laughing more, even spending some time together outside of work. She was different from anyone I had ever known, but in ways that started to make sense to me. She didn't have the same priorities I did, but she had something I was missing, a sense of balance. She wasn't obsessed with perfection, and she didn't hide behind her work like I did. She showed me what it was like to live in the moment, to not always be so worried about what's next. It wasn't all easy. There were moments when I felt out of my comfort zone, when I wanted to go back to the safe, predictable routine I had created for myself. But Kate didn't let me. She pushed me to try new things, even when I wasn't sure I could. She encouraged me to take a walk when I was overwhelmed, to leave work early on a Friday to grab drinks, to take a chance and go for something bigger than what I thought I deserved. We spent weekends exploring the city, visiting new spots, trying different things. There was a time we went to a comedy show, something I would have never done on my own, and I ended up laughing so hard I cried. She introduced me to people from all walks of life, people who didn't care about resumes or job titles, who just wanted to connect over something real. She taught me how to take risks, how to be vulnerable, how to be more than just a list of achievements. But the biggest change came when I finally let myself care about something outside of my career. I realized that I had been so focused on getting ahead that I had completely neglected the parts of me that made me happy, the parts that needed a break from the constant grind. Kate didn't just make me see that, she made me embrace it. The funny thing is, I still wasn't sure if I'd call her a best friend. She was more like a whirlwind, someone who kept my life from becoming too dull and predictable. And for once, I was okay with that. I wasn't trying to control everything anymore. I was learning to let go and enjoy life. I started making more time for myself, for my friends, for the things I loved. And I started to realize how much I had been missing, how much life had to offer outside of work and ambition. Kate changed my life, but not in the way I expected. She didn't give me some magical answer to all my problems. She didn't tell me how to be successful in the traditional sense. What she gave me was a different kind of success, a fuller, richer life, one that wasn't all about achievements, but about connection and joy. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes I still caught myself slipping back into old habits. But every time I did, I remembered what she taught me. I remembered that life doesn't have to be all about control and perfection. Sometimes, it's about letting go and enjoying the unexpected moments. I never thought I'd find someone like Kate, and I definitely never thought I'd become the person I am today because of her. But I'm glad I did. If you're reading this and you feel like your life is just a list of tasks to check off, maybe it's time to find your own Kate. Maybe it's time to let go of that constant need for control and see what happens when you embrace the unpredictable. Because sometimes, the most unlikely friendships are the ones that change everything. I learned a shocking truth about my best friend's past. I learned a shocking truth about my best friend's past. It was a stormy Friday evening when everything I thought I knew about my best friend, Jake, came crashing down. We were holed up in my apartment, rain pounding against the windows and lightning splitting the sky in jagged white lines. The two of us had been friends since grade school, practically inseparable, and we'd weathered our fair share of teenage drama and early adulthood misadventures. I thought I knew everything about him, the embarrassing childhood stories, his high school crushes, and even the secrets he'd sworn me to keep, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to discover. We were playing one of our usual rounds of video games, trading playful insults and laughing over a half-eaten box of pizza, when Jake's phone buzzed. His laughter died mid-sentence as he glanced at the screen, and an expression I couldn't quite place flickered across his face. Fear, maybe. Guilt? Whatever it was gone in an instant, replaced by a forced smile that I could tell was all wrong. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he put his phone face down on the table, muttered something about a spam call, and reached for another slice of pizza. But the moment had passed, the easy atmosphere soured by something I couldn't quite identify. The game carried on, but my mind was elsewhere, turning over that weird moment in my head. Jake was usually so easygoing, the kind of guy who could shrug off almost anything. But whatever had been on that phone had shaken him. After a while, he excused himself to the bathroom, and I couldn't help it. I glanced at his phone, still sitting there on the table. The screen had lit up again with a text notification. Now, I'm not usually one to snoop, but there was something about the way Jake had reacted that made my curiosity gnaw at me like an itch. I rationalized it to myself, if it really was something harmless, then no harm done. But when I picked up the phone and read the text, my heart nearly stopped. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message was what got me. "You can't hide from your past forever. They're coming." A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I just stared at the words, trying to process them. Who was they? What past was this message talking about? The bathroom door creaked open, and I barely managed to put the phone back down before Jake stepped back into the room. He looked at me, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw that I'd missed before. I knew I had to ask him about it, but I wasn't sure how. Jake sat down, and I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, my brain churning through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. When Jake finally left for the night, I found myself pacing the living room. That message burned into my thoughts. I couldn't sleep. The storm outside had only grown worse, and the wind howled around the building, rattling the windows. I kept thinking about all the times Jake had been there for me, the friend who'd helped me through heartbreaks, failures, and everything in between. But now there was something he hadn't told me, something big. And I needed to know what it was. The next morning, I made up my mind. I called Jake, but he didn't pick up, so I decided to pay him a visit. His apartment was a short walk away, and I braved the still drizzling rain to get there. When I arrived, I found his front door slightly ajar. A bad feeling twisted in my gut as I stepped inside, calling his name. No answer. The place was eerily silent, and my heart thumped painfully in my chest. I searched the apartment, and it looked like he'd left in a hurry. Drawers were open, clothes scattered everywhere, and his laptop sat abandoned on the coffee table, the screen still on. I hesitated before approaching it, but the unease I felt pushed me forward. The screen displayed a web page that looked like some kind of forum, filled with threads about conspiracy theories, missing persons, and encrypted messages. One thread in particular had Jake's username attached to it, and the title made my blood run cold: Survivors of Project Obsidian, share your story. My pulse pounded in my ears as I read through the thread. Jake had posted under an alias, but I recognized his writing, the humor and sarcasm that only he could pull off. But what he was talking about was anything but funny. He described being part of something called Project Obsidian, a government experiment that had been officially erased from history. The details were vague, but he mentioned being taken as a child, subjected to tests, and eventually escaping. I struggled to breathe, my mind reeling with the implications. Jake had never mentioned anything like this before, not even once. My childhood best friend had been harboring a secret so massive, so impossible, that I didn't know what to believe. Just then, the front door slammed shut, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around to see Jake standing there, soaked to the bone, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and tight. "Jake, what the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He closed his eyes, running a hand through his wet hair. "I didn't want you involved," he said. "I never wanted anyone involved." He explained, his voice hushed and hurried, how Project Obsidian had been a Black Ops government program, one that specialized in creating enhanced individuals. He had been one of their experiments, and for years, he'd been hiding from the people who wanted to bring him back. The message on his phone was a warning, he told me, from another survivor. "They found me," he said, his voice breaking. "And now they'll come for anyone I care about." I was shaking, the floor seeming to tilt beneath me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, hurt blooming in my chest. "Because it was safer that way," he said, his eyes full of regret. "But it's too late now." Just then, a noise from outside made us both freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed up the stairwell. Jake's eyes widened, and he grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back window. "We have to go," he said, and before I could protest, we were clambering out onto the fire escape, rain slicking the metal beneath our feet. Below us, a group of men in dark suits and tactical gear burst into Jake's apartment, their voices sharp and commanding. My mind was a blur of terror and confusion as Jake led me down the fire escape, his grip on my arm bruisingly tight. We hit the ground running, splashing through puddles and ducking into alleyways, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. We didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of the city, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse. Jake turned to me, his face pale but determined. "I'm sorry," he said, and there was so much sorrow in his eyes. "For dragging you into this. What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked out at the rain, the storm still raging. "We survive," he said, and something in his voice told me that this was just the beginning. The life I had known, the friendship I had taken for granted, was gone, replaced by a reality I still couldn't fully comprehend. But as I stood there, soaked and terrified, I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, I wasn't leaving Jake's side. Not now, not ever. I overheard a life-changing secret at a party. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just a friend's housewarming party in a neighborhood that was a little too upscale, with the kind of crowd that looked more at home in a magazine spread than in real life. I'd almost skipped it altogether, exhausted from a long week, but something about the invitation had intrigued me. Maybe it was the vague promise of unforgettable surprises, or maybe it was just that itch to escape my usual routine. So, there I was, mingling awkwardly, sipping my drink as I wandered from group to group, feeling like an outsider among people who seemed to have it all figured out. I didn't know many people there, but everyone seemed connected, as though there was some invisible thread binding them together in a way I didn't quite understand. That's when I noticed a small room off to the side, dimly lit, with the door cracked open just enough to catch a glimpse inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted toward it, peeking inside. There was a man and a woman standing close, their voices low, urgent. I couldn't help but eavesdrop, my hand frozen on the door frame as their conversation unfolded, and in that moment, I felt like I'd stumbled into something I was never meant to hear. The man, whom I recognized as one of the hosts, was whispering frantically about something that sounded like a mistake from years ago, a mistake that he said he could never make right. He kept saying that he couldn't let anyone find out, that if this secret got out, his life would be over. The woman was trying to calm him down, but her own voice trembled with fear, as though she knew the weight of what they were discussing. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but then he mentioned something about a family member, a child who wasn't his, a lie that had somehow spiraled out of control. My mind raced, piecing together bits of their conversation, and suddenly I realized they were talking about something so big, so deeply personal, that it had the power to unravel lives, destroy relationships, tear families apart. The man's voice cracked as he confessed that he'd kept this secret for nearly 20 years, that he'd never planned on revealing it, but recent events had brought it all back to the surface, and he didn't know what to do. I felt a pang of dread in my stomach, the kind of unease that you can't quite explain, that tells you something is terribly wrong. I should have walked away then, pretended I hadn't heard anything, gone back to the party and left these strangers to their twisted mess. But I couldn't move, frozen by the gravity of what I'd just overheard. I didn't know these people, didn't know their story, but suddenly I felt as though I was tangled in their web, as though I had become part of this secret, whether I wanted to be or not. After a few more moments of whispered desperation, they left the room, both of them looking pale and haunted, and I quickly ducked away, pretending to examine a painting on the wall as they passed by. The rest of the night was a blur, the drinks tasted bitter, the laughter around me felt hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, stepped into a world that was darker than I could have imagined. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying their conversation, the sheer weight of their words pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge, didn't know if I could just forget what I'd heard. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but every time I saw a family laughing together, every time I heard someone talk about trust, or loyalty, or betrayal, the memory would resurface, gnawing at me, haunting me. I started to feel like I was carrying their secret, like it had somehow bled into my own life, staining everything it touched. One day, out of sheer desperation, I decided to confront the host, to tell him what I'd heard and demand an explanation. I didn't know what I'd say or what I hoped to achieve, but I couldn't keep carrying this alone. I tracked him down, cornered him in a quiet cafe, and as soon as he saw me, he knew why I was there. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses, instead, he just looked at me with a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he'd been expecting this day to come. He told me everything, filling in the gaps of what I'd overheard that night. The child he'd spoken of was his son, but not biologically. He'd raised the boy as his own, never revealing the truth to anyone, not even to his wife. The real father had been his best friend, who died in a tragic accident, and he'd made a promise to protect the secret, to keep the child safe, no matter the cost. But now the boy, a young man in his 20s, was asking questions, digging into his past, and the host was terrified that the truth would come out, that his carefully constructed life would collapse around him. He looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me if I could understand why he'd done it, why he'd lied to everyone, why he'd built his life on a foundation of secrets. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could ever truly understand. But I realized then that this secret, this burden, was something he'd carried alone for so long, something that had haunted him in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I walked away from that meeting feeling both heavier and lighter, as though I'd taken a piece of his burden with me, yet somehow freed myself from its grip. I knew then that I could never reveal his secret, that it wasn't mine to share, that I'd stumbled into this world by accident and it wasn't my place to disrupt it. In the end, I never told anyone else what I'd overheard that night. But the experience changed me, made me see people differently, made me understand that everyone carries hidden scars, that we're all fighting battles no one else can see. And even now, years later, I think back to that night, to that secret I overheard, and I wonder if it's still buried, still hidden, or if the truth has finally come to light. Either way, I know that it's not my story to tell, it's a ghost that will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. It started as a regular weekend, or at least I thought it would be, with plans to attend a friend's engagement party at a cozy little venue on the outskirts of town. I was excited, dressed in my best, and ready to celebrate. Little did I know, I was about to come face to face with someone I'd once thought I'd spend my entire life with, my first love. I hadn't seen him in years, and honestly, I thought I'd buried that chapter of my life deep enough that it would never resurface. But there he was, standing across the room, looking as if time had barely touched him. He was talking to someone, laughing in that way I'd remembered all too well, the way that used to make my heart race. For a second, I felt like a teenager again, overcome with a wave of nostalgia, mixed with that pit in your stomach kind of feeling that I hadn't experienced in ages. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but somehow, I couldn't. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked right at me. Our eyes met, and in that split second, the years seemed to melt away, replaced by the raw memory of everything we'd been, and all we hadn't been. He made his way over, and with each step, my heart raced faster. I could barely manage to steady myself as he smiled and said, "Hey, it's been a while, hasn't it?" My mind raced through everything I wanted to say, the questions I'd had for years, the things left unsaid. But all that came out was, "Yeah, it really has." We fell into easy conversation, which surprised me. Somehow, it felt like no time had passed at all. We reminisced about our shared memories, the ridiculous things we'd done as young, foolish kids in love, and there was a part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could start over. That's when the door opened, and she walked in. She was beautiful, elegant, and confident, the kind of woman who radiated poise and style, the type I'd always felt I could never be. She walked right over to us and slid her arm around his waist, giving me a quick, appraising look before flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said, extending a hand. He looked a little uneasy, as if he hadn't expected her to show up just yet, but he quickly masked it with a smile of his own. "This is my fiancé," he said, his words stabbing through me like a knife. Fiancé. The word hung heavy in the air, filling the space between us with a thick, awkward tension. I forced a smile, trying to hide the hurt that was clawing its way to the surface. He had moved on, and clearly, he was serious about this woman, this stranger who now stood beside him, claiming the future we'd once dreamed of sharing. It was a strange feeling, to see the life I'd imagined with him in someone else's hands. I could tell Sarah was trying to gauge me, her eyes flicking back and forth between us, perhaps sensing the history that was silently screaming between us. She didn't let go of him, holding on to him a little tighter, as if staking her claim. I excused myself, pretending I needed to grab a drink, hoping to escape before my emotions betrayed me. As I stood at the bar, clutching my drink, trying to steady my breathing, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was him again, and the look in his eyes told me he'd followed me to talk. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight," he said softly, as if that would somehow soften the blow of seeing him with someone else. "Neither did I replied, not meeting his gaze. "But I guess life has a funny way of throwing curveballs," he sighed, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more, something deeper, but instead, he just apologized. He apologized for everything, how things ended, how he handled it, how he moved on too fast. He admitted that he'd thought about reaching out 1,000 times but never did, fearing it would stir up old wounds. The sincerity in his voice made it worse because part of me wanted to forgive him, to let it go, but the other part of me was still hurt, still carrying the weight of what we'd lost. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared beside us, her gaze sharp, clearly not pleased with how close we were standing. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice polite but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. I nodded quickly, eager to escape the tension. I could see that she was uncomfortable, and honestly, so was I. I didn't want to be the reason for any strain between them, didn't want to be a shadow from the past creeping into his new life. I excused myself again, but this time, he didn't follow. As the evening went on, I found myself constantly aware of them, stealing glances when I thought no one was watching. And each time I saw them together, laughing, whispering, holding hands, a part of me ached with the realization that he had moved on, and I hadn't. I'd been holding on to a ghost, a memory, while he'd built a future with someone else. Toward the end of the night, just as I was about to leave, he came up to me one last time. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, his tone soft, almost regretful. I managed a small smile, knowing this was truly the end. "Goodbye," I replied, feeling a strange mix of closure and lingering sadness. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder what could have been, but I also realized that maybe this was the universe's way of finally setting me free. I left the party with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of clarity. It hurt, yes, but I knew it was time to let go, to move on, and to find happiness in the life I had, rather than the life I'd once dreamed of with him. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had to define me. My husband's family expects me to pay for their lavish vacation. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this, but here I am, caught in the crosshairs of family expectations and financial burden. My husband, Ben, and I had always enjoyed a comfortable life together, but we weren't wealthy by any means. We worked hard for what we had, saving up for vacations and special moments. That's why, when Ben's family announced their plans for a lavish vacation to a tropical paradise, I felt a pit forming in my stomach. It was meant to be a joyful reunion, a way for everyone to bond and celebrate family togetherness. But when the family group chat lit up with excitement about the trip, I noticed something alarming: the assumption that I would contribute significantly to the cost. At first, I tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. I was busy with work and preparing for our upcoming move, so I didn't have time to engage in the chatter. But when I received a direct message from Ben's sister, Chloe, it became clear that my silence had been interpreted as agreement. "Hey, we're counting on you to help cover some of the expenses for the vacation. It's going to be amazing, and it wouldn't be the same without you." I felt my heart sink. My mind raced as I processed the implications. Why should I be expected to pay for a vacation that I hadn't even planned for? I messaged Ben, hoping to get his support. "Can you talk to your family about this? I don't think it's fair for me to shoulder part of the cost." Ben's response was disappointing. "They're just excited, and they've always seen you as part of the family. Can't you help out a little? It'll mean a lot to them." I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Why was he siding with them? I had always been there for his family, supporting their events and gatherings, but this felt different. It felt like an obligation rather than a choice. Days turned into a week, and the pressure mounted. Chloe and Ben's parents kept messaging me about the trip, sending links to luxurious resorts, lavish dinners, and excursions that were far beyond our budget. "We'll all pitch in, and it'll be unforgettable," they said, but I knew that my pitching in meant far more than a share of the costs. It meant sacrificing my own hard-earned savings. One evening, as I sat on the couch, scrolling through the family chat, I saw that Ben's cousin had posted a photo of a stunning villa they wanted to stay at, along with a breakdown of costs that sent my heart racing. "We can each chip in $1,500. It'll be worth it." I stared at the screen in disbelief. This was outrageous. I could feel my blood boiling as I typed a response, only to stop myself. I didn't want to cause conflict, but I also couldn't just let this slide. That night, I confronted Ben. "I can't go through with this. I can't pay that much for a vacation that's supposed to be a family trip. It feels wrong," he sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "They're just excited. Can't you try to see it from their perspective? It's not like they're asking for a lot." "Not a lot." I shot back, my voice rising. "That's a significant amount of money for us. I don't understand why I'm being pressured into this." He looked at me, frustration etched on his face. "It's family. Just think about how much it would mean to them. They don't have a lot of chances to get together like this." I felt utterly alone. It seemed like I was fighting a losing battle against expectations, and I couldn't understand why Ben couldn't see my side. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted further. I was bombarded with messages from his family, each one more insistent than the last. "We're counting on you. It'll be so much fun. You can't let us down." It felt like a wave of guilt was crashing over me, pulling me under. I decided to take a stand. I texted the family group chat, stating clearly that while I loved them and wanted to be part of the trip, I could not afford to contribute in the way they expected. The response was immediate and explosive. "What do you mean you can't help out? This is a family vacation. We're all in this together. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the messages flew back and forth. Ben's family, the same people I had spent years growing close to, turned on me in an instant. I read their messages, feeling the sting of their words. Selfish. Ungrateful. I was taken aback by how quickly their support turned to hostility. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising. Ben tried to mediate, but his efforts only fueled the fire. "You're making them feel bad," he said. "You don't want to ruin this for everyone, do you?" I felt crushed, like the very ground beneath me was crumbling away. I had stood my ground, yet it felt like I was the one being punished. The emotional toll was exhausting. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to the family drama. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing a part of my family. One night, after an especially tense day, I heard Ben on the phone with his mom, his voice hushed but filled with urgency. I could make out bits of their conversation, and my heart sank as I heard her say, "Maybe she's just not the right fit for our family." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Was this really happening? My stomach twisted with anxiety as I realized that the family I had loved and supported for years was now questioning my place among them because I wouldn't pay for their lavish vacation. I confronted Ben afterward, my voice shaking with hurt. "How could you let them talk about me like that? I thought we were a team." He looked guilty but defensive. "You need to understand. They're just trying to include you, and maybe you should consider that they're right. You don't want to be the one who ruins this for everyone." His words struck me like a slap to the face. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the life I had built with Ben and the reality of being pushed away by his family. The following days felt like an emotional roller coaster. I spent countless hours scrolling through their group chat, seeing them make plans and jokes, all while I felt like an outsider. Finally, the day of the trip arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I had made it clear I wouldn't be attending, but part of me wished I could just pack my bags and join them, ignoring the hurt and resentment. As I watched them board the plane and the group photos flooding my feed, I felt a profound sense of loss wash over me. It was as if I was witnessing my life slipping through my fingers. I realized I had sacrificed my own happiness to fit into a mold that no longer served me. In the weeks that followed, Ben and I struggled to find common ground. He was torn between his family and his wife, and the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could sense the frustration building between us, and as much as I wanted to bridge the gap, every attempt felt futile. Then, one day, I received a message from Ben. "I think it's best if we take a break." The words shattered me. My heart raced as I read and reread the message, hoping it was a mistake. But deep down, I knew this was the reality I had feared. I had stood my ground for what I believed in, but now I was facing the consequences. As the days turned into weeks, I began to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I focused on my work, threw myself into my hobbies, and started to rediscover who I was outside of my relationship with Ben. The pain was raw, but I slowly learned to accept that sometimes, standing up for yourself meant facing difficult choices. In the end, I learned that love shouldn't come with a price tag, and family shouldn't demand sacrifices that push you away. It was a painful journey, but it was one I had to take to find my own strength. I learned to embrace the power of self-worth, even if it meant letting go of what I thought was a forever kind of love. If you're reading this, know that it's okay to set boundaries, to say no, and to prioritize your own happiness. Sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the most profound growth, and no one should ever feel obligated to pay for someone else's dreams at the cost of their own happiness. My awkward encounter with an old teacher, lessons learned. I hadn't thought about Mr. Foster in years, but there he was, standing in front of the dairy aisle at nearly midnight, looking as startled to see me as I was to see him. Mr. Foster was my high school history teacher, infamous for his strict demeanor and relentless discipline. He was that teacher, the one everyone quietly feared and respected, even if they didn't always like him. Back then, I hadn't exactly been his favorite, but I'd always admired his passion for teaching, even if he could be a bit intimidating. Now, though, years later, he looked different, older, worn down, his eyes hollowed by shadows, and a twitch of something I couldn't place. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, polite smiles and small talk, though his eyes never quite seemed to meet mine, always darting to something over my shoulder or down to his shoes. He asked about my life, work, if I'd kept in touch with any classmates, his tone almost too casual. I gave vague answers, trying to gauge his mood. Then he began mentioning names of classmates I hadn't thought about in years, names of students who had either clashed with him or whom he'd seemed especially hard on. It was odd, him asking about those specific people, and I felt a twinge of discomfort growing with each question. Then he asked if I'd ever felt like he'd treated us unfairly, like maybe he'd been too strict or harsh, and before I could really answer, he suddenly invited me to grab a coffee, claiming he had something to explain. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reluctantly agreed. We found a 24-hour diner nearby, and the whole way there, he seemed distracted, nervous, almost rehearsing something under his breath. Sitting across from him, I felt the atmosphere shift. He seemed less like the imposing teacher I'd once known and more like a man carrying a heavy weight. He began talking about how, as a teacher, he'd always seen potential in certain students, myself included, and how sometimes he worried he'd let that get to his head. "You were different," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, as though he were confessing a secret he'd held for years. I nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. He went on, talking about how his methods may have been unconventional, but how they were necessary. Then his tone shifted, growing darker, more regretful. "There are things," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the table, "things I wish I could undo." He trailed off, his fingers drumming on the table, his face a mask of conflict. My heart started to race as he talked about ethical lines and gray areas, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want to hear where this was going. I mumbled something about needing to leave soon, but he blocked my way, insisting I stay a little longer, as though he needed me to bear witness to whatever confession he was about to spill. Trapped, I tried to appear calm, nodding along as he spoke, all the while trying to think of a way to leave without setting him off. He leaned in, whispering, "Sometimes, you find yourself doing things you wouldn't normally do, all because you think it's right in the moment." His eyes had this haunted look, his voice wavering as if he were on the edge of a breakdown. I mumbled an excuse, something about needing the restroom, and slipped away as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I dialed my friend's number, desperate to get out. When I came back, he was sitting there, calmer, eerily so, as if purging his soul had given him peace. He thanked me, his expression almost serene, and he walked out of the diner without another word. I sat there, stunned, trying to process everything, but a part of me didn't want to dwell on it. Later, I learned from an old classmate that Mr. Foster's name had been brought up in a few school scandals, allegations of misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug, though nothing was ever proven. It was surreal to think that this man, who I'd once respected, had carried secrets so dark, and even more chilling to realize I'd been inches away from a confession that might have changed everything I thought I knew. The memory of that night haunts me still, the uneasy feeling that I barely escaped something truly sinister. When my kids stood up for me, a lesson in courage. When my kids stood up for me, a lesson in courage. It was a late evening when the incident happened, one that started off so ordinarily that I never could have imagined it would turn into a nightmare. My 8-year-old son, Jack, and I had just finished dinner. He was busy building a Lego tower at the kitchen table while I washed dishes, the sound of water splashing over plates mingling with his cheerful humming. Life hadn't been easy lately. As a single parent juggling a stressful job and raising a kid on my own, every day felt like a marathon, but we were getting by, and Jack's laughter made everything worth it. The quiet comfort of our evening was abruptly shattered by a loud, aggressive pounding on the front door. I froze, the soapy dish slipping from my hands into the sink with a clatter. Jack's humming stopped, and he looked up, wide-eyed. We exchanged a silent, worried glance before I wiped my hands on a towel and cautiously approached the door. My heart was already racing, a sense of foreboding settling in my chest. "Who is it?" I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. There was a moment of silence, and then a rough, unfamiliar voice answered, "Open the door. We need to talk." The tone sent chills down my spine. I peeked through the peephole and saw 2 men standing on the porch, both dressed in dark, rumpled clothes with hardened expressions. They didn't look like anyone I knew, and they certainly didn't seem friendly. I swallowed hard and turned back to Jack, who was now clutching a Lego piece in his small hand, his face pale. "Stay here," I whispered to him, and he nodded, eyes wide with worry. I cracked the door open just enough to face the men. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice wavering. The taller man, who had a jagged scar running down his left cheek, stepped forward. "We're here about a debt," he said, his eyes narrowing. My stomach twisted. "A debt?" I had no idea what he was talking about. "I think you have the wrong person," I replied, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. The second man, stockier and wearing a stained baseball cap, sneered. "No mistake," he said. "We know you live here. Your name is on our list." Panic surged through me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what they could possibly mean. Sure, money was always tight, but I didn't owe anyone anything that would warrant a visit like this. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, starting to close the door, but the taller man slammed his hand against it, stopping me. My breath hitched, and Jack let out a small, frightened whimper from behind me. The men noticed, and the taller one's gaze shifted past me, landing on Jack. "Nice kid you got there," he drawled. My protective instincts kicked in, and I stepped fully in front of the door, blocking Jack from their view. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police," I threatened, but the words felt hollow. The men exchanged a look, clearly not intimidated. "Go ahead," the one with the baseball cap said. "By the time they get here, it'll be too late." I could feel my hands trembling. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, the realization that I couldn't physically protect my son from these men. But then, something extraordinary happened. Jack, who had been silent and scared, stepped forward, clutching his Lego tower in his hands. His small voice rang out, surprisingly steady. "You leave my mom alone?" he said, his little body standing as tall as he could manage. The men turned their attention to him, and for a moment, the tension seemed to freeze, the air thick with disbelief. "What did you say, kid?" the scarred man asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Jack's chin wobbled, but he held his ground, his eyes fierce. "I said, leave her alone." He repeated, louder this time. His voice trembled at the edges, but his courage was undeniable. In that instant, a fire lit within me. Seeing my son stand up to these men, even when he was clearly terrified, snapped me out of my fear. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination. "You heard him," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "Get off my property. Now." The men looked taken aback, and for a split second, I saw doubt flicker across their faces. Maybe they hadn't expected resistance, or maybe they were thrown off by the fierce defiance of an 8-year-old. Whatever it was, it gave me the strength to hold my ground. Jack stepped closer to me, his little hand reaching out to grab mine, and I squeezed it tightly. "We're not going anywhere," the scarred man snapped, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You have 5 seconds to leave," I said, pulling out my phone and starting to dial. I was bluffing about how fast the police would come, but I hoped the sight of me making the call would be enough. The two men hesitated, and then, to my immense relief, they backed off. "This isn't over," the man with the baseball cap spat, but they turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I slammed the door shut, bolting it and leaning against it as my legs threatened to give out. My whole body was shaking, but I felt a rush of pride and awe as I looked at Jack. His face crumpled, and he started to cry, the adrenaline giving way to the terror he had felt. I scooped him up into my arms, holding him tightly. "You were so brave," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so proud of you." We stayed like that for a while, clinging to each other in the aftermath of the horror we had just faced. Later, once the police had come and gone, taking our statements and promising to increase patrols in the area, Jack and I sat together on the couch. He was still a little shaky, but he looked up at me with wide, earnest eyes. "Mom," he said, "I was really scared." I stroked his hair, my heart aching with love. "I know, sweetheart," I said, "but you stood up anyway. That's what being brave means." He thought about that, for a moment, then nodded, a small smile breaking through the fear. That night, as I tucked Jack into bed, I realized that he had taught me something profound. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about standing up even when fear feels overwhelming. My son, my sweet, small son, had shown me the kind of strength that can only come from love. And that, I knew, would always be enough to keep us going, no matter what came next. I was shunned by my family for choosing my passion. I was shunned by my family for choosing my passion. I still remember the day I told them, sitting around the dinner table with that uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she asked if I was serious, if I had truly made up my mind. My father wouldn't even look at me. My siblings sat there, eyes down, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. I had spent years suppressing my dreams, working in the family business, trying to be the son they wanted, the son who would carry on the legacy and make them proud. But it was suffocating, like being trapped in a life that wasn't mine, a life built on expectations that I'd never wanted for myself. So, when I finally told them that I was leaving, that I was done following their rules, their plans, their dreams, the air turned thick with tension, and I could feel their disappointment like a weight pressing down on me. They thought I was throwing my life away, abandoning everything they'd built, everything they'd sacrificed to give me, for something they saw as a foolish hobby, a fleeting obsession. But it wasn't a hobby to me, it was everything I'd ever wanted, the only thing that made me feel alive. I thought they'd understand, thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd support me, even if they didn't fully agree. But I was wrong. That night, my father told me that if I left, I was no longer part of the family, that I was dead to them. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my heart breaking, splintering under the weight of his anger and disappointment. My mother just cried, begging me to reconsider, to think about what I was giving up. My siblings sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes refusing to meet mine. It was like I'd become a stranger, an outsider in my own home. When I packed my bags, there were no goodbyes, no tearful farewells. They just watched as I walked out the door, their faces cold, unfeeling. I tried to convince myself that they'd come around, that they'd see how happy I was, how much this meant to me, but as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the silence from them became deafening. They didn't call, didn't write, didn't check in to see if I was okay. It was like I'd never existed. I threw myself into my passion, working day and night, determined to prove them wrong, to show them that this wasn't a phase, that this was what I was meant to do. But no matter how much success I found, no matter how many milestones I reached, there was always this emptiness, this ache that reminded me of what I'd lost, of the family I'd left behind. I'd see them sometimes, in passing, walking down the street or at the grocery store, but they'd look right through me, like I was a ghost, a shadow of someone they used to know. The pain was unbearable, this feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a memory they'd chosen to erase. Then one night, I got a call from my sister, the first time I'd heard her voice in over a year. She sounded scared, her voice trembling as she told me that something was wrong, that our father was sick, that he didn't have much time left. My heart sank, the pain of the past year rushing back in a wave of guilt and regret. I wanted to go to him, to be there for him, to tell him that I was sorry, that I'd never meant to hurt him. But when I showed up at the hospital, my mother looked at me with a hatred I'd never seen before. She told me that I wasn't welcome, that I had no right to be there, that I'd given up my place in the family the day I'd walked out that door. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand that I was still their son, that I still loved them, but she wouldn't listen. She told me that I was selfish, that I'd broken their hearts, that I'd torn the family apart with my choices. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her words, her anger, her bitterness. My siblings wouldn't even look at me, their faces blank, cold, like they didn't know me. I was alone, standing in that sterile hospital hallway, the sounds of machines and distant voices echoing around me, and I realized that I had truly lost them, that they had cast me out, that I was nothing to them. In that moment, I felt a darkness settle over me, a hollow emptiness that I knew would never go away. I walked out of that hospital feeling like a part of me had died, like I'd lost a piece of my soul that I'd never get back. I went back to my life, to my passion, to the thing that had given me purpose, but it felt empty, meaningless. I'd spent so long trying to prove myself, trying to show them that I was more than their expectations, but in the end, I'd lost everything that had ever mattered to me. I don't know if I'll ever see them again, don't know if they'll ever forgive me. But I do know that the pain of being shunned, of being cast out by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And every night, as I lie awake, haunted by memories of the family I once had, I wonder if it was all worth it, if following my passion was worth the price I paid. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise was one of those moments you only read about in books or see in movies, the kind of thing you never actually think will happen to you. My partner, Ben, had always been quiet and somewhat reserved, the type of person who preferred to stay in the background at parties, content to listen rather than talk, and while he was a kind, funny, and incredibly supportive partner, he'd never given me any reason to think he was hiding something extraordinary. We'd been together for 3 years, living in a small, cozy apartment that suited us just fine, a life filled with routines that were comfortable and predictable, which was exactly how I thought we both liked it. Ben was an accountant by day, a creature of habit who'd rather spend an evening watching reruns of sitcoms on the couch than going out on some wild adventure. So, imagine my shock when, during a casual evening at home, I stumbled upon something that turned my entire understanding of him upside down. It happened completely by accident. I was cleaning out the closet while he was out running errands, looking for an old photo album I hadn't seen in a while, when my hand brushed against a dusty, nondescript box tucked away in the far corner. It was one of those old wooden boxes with intricate carvings on the lid, something that looked too old to belong to Ben, who I'd never known to have a sentimental attachment to anything other than his favorite coffee mug. Curious, I pulled it out, wiping away years of dust, and pried it open, half expecting to find some forgotten trinket or maybe an old journal. Instead, what I found left me speechless. Inside was a small stack of photographs, not of Ben or his family but of stunningly realistic paintings, each one more breathtaking than the last. They were of landscapes, cities, people, some smiling, some looking wistful, each one imbued with a life and emotion that seemed to leap off the paper. I thought at first that maybe he'd bought these or collected them somehow, but something about the way the box was hidden, the careful way they were arranged, told me these paintings were more than just a collection. Beneath the photographs was a small sketchbook, the pages filled with quick, meticulous sketches of everything from animals to bustling city streets, each one done with such precision that it was like peering into a frozen moment in time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it, a small, folded note tucked into the back of the box, with the words to remember scrawled across the front in Ben's familiar handwriting. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, feeling as though I was intruding on something deeply personal, but my curiosity had completely taken over. The note was short, barely more than a few lines, but it hit me like a punch. It read, "To remember who I was before I became who I am. To remember the part of me I had to leave behind." I sat there, staring at the note, feeling a strange mixture of confusion and awe. Who was this person I'd been living with for 3 years, and what was this hidden life he'd left behind? That evening, when Ben returned home, I couldn't keep it to myself. I held up the box, feeling my hands shake slightly, and asked him point blank, "Ben, what is this?" He froze, his face draining of color as he looked from the box to me, a flicker of something unrecognizable in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was about to deny everything, but then he let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair, and sat down on the edge of the bed, motioning for me to join him. What he told me was a story I could have never expected. As it turned out, before he met me, before he settled into the life I thought was all he'd ever known, Ben had been an artist, a serious, passionate artist who had once dreamed of making a living from his paintings. He'd spent years studying, honing his skills, pouring everything he had into his art, and for a while, he'd even been on the verge of his big break. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Just as he was gaining recognition, he'd been hit with a series of personal setbacks, family issues, financial troubles, things that had pulled him away from his dream, forcing him to find a stable job, to grow up and leave his art behind. He kept it hidden, he said, because he didn't want me to see him as a failure, as someone who'd given up on his dreams, and he didn't want to open that part of himself again. But now, as he spoke, I could see something in his eyes, a spark, a flicker of the passion he'd buried for so long, and I felt a swell of something indescribable, a mix of love, admiration, and a strange sadness for the person he'd been and the dreams he'd left behind. After that night, something shifted between us. I encouraged him, gently, to pick up a paintbrush again, to try creating just for himself, no pressure, no expectations. At first, he resisted, claiming he was too rusty, that he'd lost whatever talent he once had, but I could see the way his fingers itched whenever he looked at a blank canvas. So, one day, I surprised him with a set of paints and brushes, leaving them on the kitchen table with a note that simply said, "For the artist in you." It took a few days, but one evening, I came home to find him sitting at the table, paintbrush in hand, a half-finished landscape spread out before him. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of nerves and excitement, and I knew in that moment that the person I'd known for 3 years was just one part of him, and now I was meeting another, deeper part that he'd hidden away. Over the next few weeks, he began to paint more and more, each canvas revealing a different piece of his soul, a side of him I'd never seen. The more he painted, the more he opened up, telling me stories of his past, of the years he'd spent chasing his dream, of the sacrifices he'd made, the things he'd lost along the way. Watching him rediscover his talent was like witnessing a transformation, a rebirth of sorts, and I felt honored to be a part of it, to see him come alive in a way I'd never seen before. Eventually, he started sharing his work online, hesitant at first, but as the positive feedback poured in, I saw his confidence grow, that old spark reignited, brighter than ever. One night, he showed me a message from an art gallery interested in his work, and the look on his face was one of pure disbelief, like he couldn't quite accept that his talent, his passion, had found its way back into his life. That night, as we celebrated with a bottle of wine and talked about the future, I realized that our relationship had deepened in a way I'd never thought possible. I hadn't just discovered his hidden talent, I'd uncovered a part of his soul, a piece of him he'd kept locked away, and in doing so, I felt like I'd fallen in love with him all over again, this time with a new understanding, a new appreciation for the person he truly was, both the man I'd known and the artist he'd become once more. How a misunderstanding led to a major life change. How a misunderstanding led to a major life change. It all started with one small, innocent mistake, the kind you laugh about later, or at least, that's what I thought. It was late on a Thursday night, and I was exhausted, mindlessly scrolling through my emails when I saw one with an unfamiliar sender name. It looked important, something from a job recruiter I'd spoken to months ago but had never heard back from. The subject line read, "Urgent, last chance for your offer." My heart skipped a beat. My current job was okay, but I'd always dreamed of moving on to something bigger, more challenging. I'd almost forgotten about applying for this job. The waiting period had stretched on so long that I'd just assumed they'd gone with someone else. But here it was, a second chance, seemingly dropped into my lap at the exact moment I was feeling stuck. I opened the email and, without even taking a breath, scanned through it. It congratulated me on my supposed acceptance into the position, though it did mention that I had to respond by the end of the week to confirm my interest. It was already Thursday night. I panicked, glancing at the clock, realizing I barely had any time left. I shot off a quick response, heart pounding, trying to sound professional despite my excitement, and hit send. My thoughts immediately filled with plans for what was next, leaving my current job, packing up, moving to a new city. It was impulsive, yes, but something inside me told me this was right. The opportunity was too perfect to pass up. The next morning, I got a reply from the recruiter. Her tone was warm but slightly confused. She thanked me for my interest, but then mentioned something strange, just to confirm, "You're interested in continuing your work as a crisis counselor in the rehabilitation program, correct?" My blood ran cold. Crisis counselor. Rehabilitation program? I'd applied for a marketing position, something about this didn't add up. Frantically, I went back to reread the email chain, realizing in horror that I'd misunderstood the offer entirely. This wasn't a corporate job, it was an opening at a rural rehabilitation center, the kind of place I'd never even considered working. My stomach dropped, panic rising as I considered my options. I'd already quit my job, and if I backed out now, I'd have nothing. Yet the thought of working in a field I knew nothing about, helping people in situations I wasn't trained for, terrified me. But something inside me whispered that maybe this was meant to happen, a twist of fate urging me to take a path I'd never dared to explore. Feeling trapped, I decided to at least visit the center, thinking that maybe I could explain the situation and back out gracefully. I made the drive out to the location they'd listed, miles away from the bustling city I knew, deep into the woods, where the landscape turned quieter, more isolated. When I arrived, I was greeted by a kind older woman, named Ellen, who mistook my hesitant expression for first-day nerves and gave me a reassuring pat on the back. There was something so comforting about her presence, something that made it hard to tell her the truth. She led me inside, introducing me to the staff, all of whom greeted me warmly. They seemed so genuine, so eager to welcome someone they believed was here to make a difference. I felt a pang of guilt, realizing that these people were counting on me, seeing something in me that I didn't even see in myself. Before I knew it, they'd handed me a uniform, set me up in a small on-site cabin, and I found myself unpacking, too embarrassed to back out. That first night, I lay awake, questioning my sanity, feeling overwhelmed and out of place, wondering how I'd ended up here. But the next morning, as I walked into the common room, the residents greeted me with cautious but hopeful smiles. I could see the weight of their struggles, the silent battles they fought, and it shook something deep within me. I knew I didn't belong here, didn't have the skills they needed, but I stayed, partly because I didn't know how to leave and partly because something about it felt strangely right. Day by day, I got to know the residents, listened to their stories, their regrets, their hopes, and the hard-won victories that others rarely saw. I didn't have much to offer, but I found myself learning more about compassion, patience, and resilience than I'd ever learned in an office cubicle. I had been so wrapped up in the corporate ladder, in the pursuit of success, that I'd never stopped to understand what real hardship looked like, or what it felt like to help people through their darkest moments. Weeks turned into months, and I began to feel a sense of purpose, a fulfillment I'd never known before. It wasn't easy. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel out of my depth, didn't make mistakes. But the staff, the residents, they didn't hold it against me. They showed me kindness, understanding, and I learned from them, grew because of them. I come here because of a misunderstanding, an accident, yet now I couldn't imagine leaving. One night, I sat outside, watching the stars with a resident who had been through more pain than I could ever imagine. She looked at me, her face soft in the moonlight, and said, "I don't know how you ended up here, but you've helped me more than you know." Sometimes, life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't see it at first. Her words struck me, and I realized she was right. Maybe I'd come here by mistake, but this place, these people, had given me a sense of purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. By the time I finally left that center, a year later, I was a different person. I didn't go back to the corporate world, didn't return to the life I'd once planned. Instead, I found myself drawn to nonprofit work, counseling, roles that allowed me to continue making a difference, however small. It was the biggest change I'd ever made, a shift I'd never expected. All because of a misunderstanding, a single email that led me down a path I'd never have chosen on my own. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I think back to that night, to the fear and uncertainty, and I realize how grateful I am for that mistake, for the chance to find a new purpose in the most unlikely of places. Caught in a lie, my friend's betrayal unraveled. Caught in a lie, my friend's betrayal unraveled. I had always trusted Lena. She was more than my best friend, she was like a sister to me, someone who knew every embarrassing secret, every dream, every mistake. But looking back, I think that's what made her betrayal sting even more. It started small, almost trivial in retrospect. She began borrowing things and not returning them, books, clothes, even my headphones. She'd swear they were still at my place, or that she was just about to bring them over, but somehow, those things never made it back to me. Then came the weird excuses when I'd invite her out. She'd say she was busy with work, dealing with family issues, or, on one bizarre occasion, taking an online course in Icelandic, of all things. I brushed it off, figuring everyone gets caught up with their own life sometimes. But then one Friday night, while scrolling through my social media, I saw a photo of Lena out with a group of people I didn't know, including one person who looked disturbingly familiar, my ex, Matt. She'd been with him at the restaurant we planned to go to that night, and they were laughing together like they'd been close forever. It felt like someone had slapped me. Matt and I hadn't ended on bad terms, but seeing her with him, after claiming she was too busy to hang out, set off alarm bells. I tried to call her, hoping there was a logical explanation, but she didn't pick up. I sat there, stewing, replaying moments of our friendship in my head, trying to piece together clues I might have missed. The next morning, she called back with an excuse about her phone dying, sounding as cheerful and carefree as ever. I confronted her, asking her if she'd been out with Matt, and she laughed it off, saying, "Oh, that. It was just a coincidence. I ran into him randomly." But something about her tone made my skin crawl. It was too breezy, too dismissive. Over the next few weeks, I noticed even more strange behavior. She would avoid certain topics, especially when I mentioned Matt, and I started noticing changes in her social media. She had a habit of blocking me from seeing her stories whenever she went out, but mutual friends would send me screenshots of her with him, seemingly cozy and always at places I had introduced her to. I felt like I was going crazy, so I decided to dig deeper. One night, I reached out to a mutual friend who was at one of those gatherings and asked what was going on. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually admitted that Lena had been seeing Matt for a few months now. She told me that Lena had even gone so far as to make up lies about me to justify why she had reached out to him, painting me as some toxic ex-girlfriend who never treated him right. My stomach twisted as she recounted things Lena had supposedly said about me, lies so absurd yet so specific that they felt carefully crafted. Feeling both sickened and furious, I decided to confront her directly. I texted her, asking if we could meet up, and when she agreed, I knew it was finally time to hear her side. We met at a coffee shop, and I went in prepared for anything, but her reaction was worse than I could have imagined. She laughed at me, an eerie, dismissive chuckle, like this whole situation was some big joke. She tried to gaslight me, saying things like, "Oh, come on, you're being dramatic," and, "Matt came to me because he needed someone sane to talk to after dealing with you." Her words stung, twisting the knife deeper with every sentence, and for the first time, I realized that the friend I thought I knew had never truly existed. I left the coffee shop in a daze, feeling hollowed out, and blocked her number, vowing never to speak to her again. But things didn't end there. Weeks after cutting her off, I noticed strange messages from unknown accounts, vague threats and weird, unsettling comments about my personal life. I knew it was Lena trying to intimidate me, trying to make me feel as if I were the one in the wrong. Months later, I heard she and Matt had broken up, apparently in a messy split filled with the same lies and manipulation she had tried to use on me. Hearing this should have made me feel vindicated, but it only deepened my sadness for what had been lost. The person I had trusted most had turned out to be a stranger, someone willing to betray me without a second thought, and as much as I wished I could go back to those simpler days, I knew that some scars never fade. I've moved on, in some ways, building new friendships and focusing on my own life, but part of me will always be haunted by the betrayal, by the lies, by the friend I thought I knew but never truly did. My partner's ex tried to ruin our relationship, here's how I fought back. My partner's ex tried to ruin our relationship, here's how I fought back. It all started when Emma and I had been dating for nearly a year, and things were finally getting serious. We had recently moved in together, a cozy little apartment filled with the warmth of our shared laughter and late-night conversations. But that joy was shattered the moment Sophie, Emma's ex, came back into the picture. It was subtle at first, almost too subtle. Emma and I were grabbing a late breakfast at our favorite brunch spot when she got a message, and I watched her face pale slightly as she read it. "It's Sophie," Emma said, her voice tight. Sophie was Emma's ex-girlfriend, and from what little I'd been told, their breakup was a complete disaster. Apparently, Sophie hadn't taken it well, spiraling into obsessive behaviors and dramatic displays of heartbreak. But Emma had assured me she was over it, that Sophie had finally moved on. However, seeing Emma's reaction that day, I knew we were in for trouble. Sophie began popping up everywhere. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. We'd run into her at the grocery store or spot her across the street while walking our dog, but soon, it became undeniably intentional. Emma was visibly anxious, and I started feeling like our relationship was under siege. We talked about it one evening, our conversation stretching into the small hours of the night. "Maybe she's just trying to get closure," Emma reasoned, but there was a note of doubt in her voice. I disagreed. Sophie's reappearances didn't feel like closure-seeking, they felt calculated. It wasn't long before we got our confirmation. One day, I came home from work to find a handwritten note slipped under our front door. The paper was torn at the edges, and the words were scrawled in a manic, almost illegible script: "You'll never be as good as me. She'll always love me." The note left a chill in my bones, but I knew we couldn't just sit around, feeling terrified. We reported it to the police, but they brushed it off as a simple case of harassment that didn't warrant action. I was furious and felt powerless, but that was only the beginning. Our social media accounts started getting strange messages, each one more unnerving than the last. Sophie had created fake profiles to lurk in our lives, posting comments that twisted the narrative of our relationship. She painted Emma as a cheater, me as a manipulative force that was controlling Emma, and our relationship as a toxic disaster waiting to implode. Our friends started getting messages too, cryptic warnings about how I wasn't to be trusted. Emma broke down one night, sobbing uncontrollably in my arms. "I thought she was gone," she whispered. I felt rage boil under my skin. I hated seeing the woman I loved brought to tears by the ghost of a toxic past. It was then that I decided I couldn't be passive anymore. I had to fight back, but it wasn't going to be easy. My first plan of attack was to gather evidence. I started documenting every message, every interaction, creating a detailed timeline of Sophie's harassment. We adjusted our privacy settings, locking down our social media and cutting off any public access points. But Sophie was relentless, finding new ways to infiltrate our lives. One morning, we woke up to find our apartment door defaced with spray paint, a neon pink insult directed at me. We knew Sophie had crossed into dangerous territory. That's when I hired a private investigator, someone who could help me uncover what Sophie was doing behind the scenes. The PI, a woman named Rebecca who carried herself with a calm authority, quickly found that Sophie was indeed monitoring us obsessively. Rebecca uncovered a web of false identities Sophie was using to infiltrate online support groups Emma was a part of. Sophie had even joined a hiking club Emma and I had recently become members of, posing as a friendly new face just to be near us. It was a level of obsession I couldn't fathom. I confronted Emma with everything Rebecca had found, and for the first time, I saw her anger spark through the fear. "We can't let her win," she said, and I agreed. That's when we decided to take our narrative back. We started our own online campaign, posting about the reality of our situation in subtle ways, making sure our friends knew the truth. We reached out to those who had received Sophie's messages, calmly explaining what was happening. To our surprise, the outpouring of support was overwhelming. People started blocking Sophie's fake accounts and reporting them en masse. But Sophie wasn't finished. The climax came on a stormy evening when we returned home from dinner to find our apartment completely trashed. Picture frames smashed, our couch slashed, and in the center of our living room was Sophie herself, eyes wide and wild. She was holding a picture of Emma and me, trembling with rage. My instincts kicked in, and I carefully stepped in front of Emma. "Call the police," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. Sophie lunged at me, screaming about how Emma belonged to her, but I managed to hold her off until the cops arrived. They took her away, and that night, Emma and I sat together in the wreckage of our home, exhausted but relieved. With Sophie finally arrested, we had enough evidence to press charges, and a restraining order was put in place. In the aftermath, Emma and I worked on rebuilding our lives, slowly patching up the cracks Sophie had tried to create between us. We went to therapy, strengthened our bond, and found peace in the little things: morning coffee, lazy Sundays, and spontaneous road trips. It wasn't easy, but we refused to let Sophie's darkness seep into our happiness. Looking back, I know we fought for what we had, and I learned that love, the kind worth fighting for, isn't something anyone can take away. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. My neighbor's secret life, I never expected this. From the moment I moved into the quiet suburb, my neighbor Joe was the last person I thought would ever become a point of intrigue. He was the picture of normality: middle-aged, graying hair, glasses that slipped down his nose, and a meticulously mowed lawn. His house was an immaculate, single-story, cookie-cutter suburban home with the classic white picket fence, and every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd be out there watering his flowers with that same steady hand and blank expression. Over the months, we exchanged the typical small talk, occasional nods, and awkward neighborly smiles, but nothing beyond that. Joe seemed to live an ordinary, uneventful life, that is, until the night I heard the sounds. It was around midnight when I first noticed it: strange thuds coming from Joe's backyard, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or maybe Joe moving something heavy, but the sounds continued night after night. Curiosity ate at me. On the fifth night, I finally decided to peek through the gap in my curtains, catching a glimpse of Joe under the dim glow of his porch light. He was dragging something large and bulky across his backyard toward the shed. The figure looked human-sized, covered in what seemed like a thick black tarp. My heart pounded as I watched him struggle to get it through the shed door before disappearing inside. I didn't sleep that night, my mind spiraling with possibilities, trying to convince myself it was just an old rug or maybe some broken furniture, but deep down, I felt something was wrong. The next morning, I casually brought up the noise to Joe when I saw him outside, hoping he'd offer some mundane explanation, but he just smiled in that unsettlingly blank way and said, "Must be the wind." I brushed it off, trying to resume life as normal, but things only got stranger. Every night, around midnight, Joe would perform his ritual, dragging something new to the shed, sometimes covered in black tarp, other times in what looked like burlap sacks. I tried to convince myself he was just a quirky guy with weird habits, but then came the incident that pushed me over the edge. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by my bedroom window, watching his movements, when suddenly, his head jerked up. He looked directly at my window, like he knew I was there, even though I'd been standing in the dark. I quickly backed away, my heart racing, but the next morning, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. Some things are best left unseen. My hands shook as I read it. Was he threatening me? Warning me? I couldn't tell, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to avoid Joe after that, but every encounter felt heavier, his casual smiles masking something far more sinister. I considered calling the police, but I had no real evidence, just paranoia and a gut feeling. Then, one evening, I was walking past his house when I noticed something strange about his car. The trunk was slightly ajar, and from the gap, I could see a flash of what looked like dark stained fabric, and a heavy, metallic scent filled the air. I forced myself to keep walking, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was very, very wrong. Days passed, and I found myself obsessively watching his house. The shed became the center of my fixation. Why was he so secretive about it? Why only go there at night? Desperate for answers, I made a plan. Late one night, when the entire street was dark and silent, I snuck into his backyard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crept toward the shed, trying the handle, but it was locked. Just as I was about to leave, I spotted a small, dusty window on the side. I peered through it, squinting to make out the shapes inside. My heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, all detailing missing persons cases from the surrounding area, some dating back years. Pictures of smiling faces, red strings connecting them, and handwritten notes filled the space. And in the center of the shed was a chair, chains bolted to its arms and legs, stained with something dark. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, to call the police, to do something. But just as I turned to leave, I froze. Joe was standing there, no more than a few feet away, his face illuminated by the dim moonlight. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked calm, as if he'd been expecting me all along. Couldn't resist, could you? He said, his voice as cold as ice. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, an apology, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, blocking my path to the gate, his eyes never leaving mine. I warned you, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Panic surged through me as I tried to push past him, but his grip was like iron, his hands cold and unyielding. I don't remember exactly how I broke free, only that I found myself stumbling back to my house, locking every door and window behind me. I stayed up all night, waiting for the knock on the door, for the sound of him breaking in, but it never came. The next day, I went to the police, desperate to report what I'd seen, but without concrete evidence, they were reluctant to believe me. They agreed to do a welfare check, but when they returned, they told me the shed was empty, no chair, no clippings, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd made the whole thing up. I couldn't believe it. Joe had cleared everything out in the span of a few hours, leaving no trace behind. In the days that followed, Joe acted as though nothing had happened. He'd wave to me from his yard, that same eerie smile plastered on his face, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding my own house, spending nights at friends' places, jumping at every creak and shadow. The paranoia became unbearable. One day, a small package arrived at my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping, detailing a missing person case from the neighboring town. Scribbled on the edge was a note in Joe's handwriting: "Curiosity has consequences." I threw the clipping away, but the message was clear. He was watching me, and he knew he'd gotten away with it. I don't know what to do now, trapped in this silent battle, terrified of what he might do if I ever try to expose him. I witnessed a crazy proposal, here's the drama that unfolded. I witnessed a crazy proposal, here's the drama that unfolded. It all started innocently enough, just another weekend dinner out with my friends at this new trendy rooftop restaurant that had just opened downtown. The place had been buzzing with people ever since it opened, with a stunning view of the skyline, live music, and a relaxed but chic vibe that just made you feel like you were a part of something special. We managed to snag a reservation on the terrace, right by the railing where you could see the city lights spread out for miles, and I was just settling into my chair when I noticed a group at the table beside us. They seemed like a fun bunch at first, and I couldn't help but notice one guy in particular who kept glancing at this woman across from him with a sort of anxious but excited expression. You know the look, like he was building up to something big. And that's when I realized, with a thrill of second-hand excitement, that this guy was probably about to propose. My friends noticed it too, and we exchanged looks, giggling quietly and half pretending not to watch as he started to reach under the table, fumbling around like he was searching for something. We all knew what was coming, or at least, we thought we did. The whole terrace seemed to hold its breath as he finally pulled out this small, black velvet box, took a deep, shaky breath, and got down on one knee. The girl gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, and for a split second, it was like we were all suspended in this magical, movie-perfect moment. But then, just as he opened the box and said her name, this other woman, sitting at a nearby table, let out this strangled, almost guttural scream. Heads turned, including the girl who was just about to be proposed to, her face shifting from surprised delight to sheer horror as she looked at this other woman. And before any of us could figure out what was going on, the woman had stormed up to them, pointing a shaking finger at the guy on his knee and yelling, "What the hell are you doing, Brandon? Who is this?" A collective gasp went through the terrace as Brandon's face went white, and he stumbled back to his feet, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. His would-be fiancée looked utterly lost, her smile melting away, and she turned to Brandon, whispering, "Brandon, who is she?" It was then that we all started to piece it together. The woman who had interrupted was his girlfriend, his actual girlfriend, and apparently, he'd been secretly seeing this other girl on the side. The way she screamed at him, her voice shaking with betrayal and rage, made it clear she had no idea he'd been leading a double life. By this point, the whole restaurant was watching, the music had stopped, and every eye was locked onto this unfolding nightmare. Brandon, caught between two women, seemed completely paralyzed, like a deer in headlights, mumbling something about how he'd meant to break it off, but hadn't gotten around to it. The girl he'd just proposed to looked like her whole world had just shattered. She kept whispering, "Is this true?" over and over, almost to herself, while the other woman, his actual girlfriend, stood there with this fierce look of betrayal, demanding answers. And then, just when we thought it couldn't get any crazier, the girlfriend reached over, grabbed the ring out of the box, and hurled it over the railing with this furious scream. The ring flew through the air, a little glint of silver against the night sky, and we all watched as it plummeted down into the street below, disappearing from sight. That's when the yelling started in earnest. The girl who had just been proposed to began sobbing, tears streaming down her face, and she demanded that Brandon tell her why he would do this, why he would go so far as to propose while leading this double life. Brandon looked utterly defeated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route, but his girlfriend wasn't letting him off the hook. She kept pressing him, her voice breaking as she told him she'd thought he was the one, that they'd been planning a life together. Her voice cracked as she asked him why he would betray her like this, especially in such a public, humiliating way. People around us were murmuring, some gasping, others pulling out their phones to record the whole thing, whispering in shock about how they'd never seen anything like it. But the heartbreak and raw emotion pouring out of these three people, right in the middle of this glamorous rooftop restaurant, was something that no camera could fully capture. At one point, the girl he'd proposed to let out this strangled laugh, wiping her tears and saying, "I thought you were the love of my life. I thought this was the happiest day of my life." The other woman scoffed, crossing her arms and saying, "Join the club." It was brutal, the way they both seemed to turn on him, united in their hurt and betrayal, while Brandon stood there, completely silent, looking like he wanted to melt into the floor. The girl he'd proposed to finally turned on her heel, storming out of the restaurant with tears streaming down her face. As she left, the entire terrace erupted in shocked whispers, a low buzz of disbelief and fascination as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. But the drama wasn't over yet. The girlfriend, who was still standing there, shot Brandon one last look of disgust and told him she never wanted to see him again, then turned and walked away, leaving him alone in front of the crowd that had witnessed his entire life fall apart in a matter of minutes. Brandon just stood there, staring at the spot where both women had disappeared, looking like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The restaurant staff were staring, some looking embarrassed, others looking like they couldn't wait to gossip about this later. The rest of us, myself included, felt like we'd just been part of some twisted, real-life soap opera that no one had seen coming. I remember looking around, seeing all the shocked faces, the quiet murmurs as people tried to wrap their heads around the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the sheer audacity of what Brandon had tried to pull off. It was the kind of thing you hear about in stories, but to see it play out right in front of us was something else entirely. As Brandon finally slinked away, leaving the restaurant with his head hanging low, the staff quickly tried to get the music back on, to reset the mood, but the energy was all wrong. My friends and I couldn't stop talking about it the rest of the night, dissecting every look, every word, replaying the shocking moment when that ring had flown over the edge. It was a proposal gone wrong in the worst possible way, and even now, thinking back on it, I'm still in disbelief that we got to witness the drama unfold so unexpectedly. The crazy part. We didn't even get our food yet when all of this went down, but by the time our appetizers arrived, we were too caught up in the gossip to even care. The day my life changed forever after a single decision. The day my life changed forever after a single decision. I didn't think much of it at the time, it was just a small choice, something that seemed almost insignificant, something people do every day without a second thought. It was a late autumn afternoon, one of those gloomy days where the sun barely breaks through the clouds and everything feels a little surreal, a little too quiet. I'd just gotten off work, the stress of the day pressing down on me, the usual parade of meetings, emails, and endless deadlines buzzing in my head. I was exhausted, hungry, and ready to go home and lose myself in a quiet evening. As I walked to my car, I noticed an older man standing just outside the parking lot, a weary look on his face, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He looked lost, out of place in his ragged clothes and faded baseball cap, his hands trembling as he glanced around like he was trying to find something or someone. Part of me wanted to just keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him and go home to unwind. But something tugged at me, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake, telling me to stop, to at least ask if he needed help. I'd heard enough horror stories to know that approaching strangers alone wasn't always the smartest move, especially after dark, but this man looked genuinely helpless. So I made the choice, the one decision that would change everything. I approached him and asked if he needed help finding something. He looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and relief, his voice shaky as he explained that he was trying to find a hospital nearby. His daughter had just been in an accident, he said, and he'd rushed over as soon as he heard, but he'd gotten lost along the way. He showed me the piece of paper with an address scribbled on it, but I recognized immediately that the hospital he was looking for was across town, at least a half-hour drive. He didn't have a phone, or a GPS, and I could see he was too frail to make the trip alone, let alone in the emotional state he was in. I hesitated, the logical part of me screaming that it was a bad idea, that I should call someone else to help him, maybe a taxi or the police, but he looked so defeated, so desperate, that I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I told him I'd take him to the hospital. We drove in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from him as he stared out the window, lost in worry. I could feel the tension, the heavy weight of his fear filling the car. When we finally arrived at the hospital, he thanked me, his voice thick with gratitude, and hurried inside. I sat there for a moment, unsure if I should leave or wait to see if he needed anything else. I decided to wait, reasoning that he might need a ride home or some kind of support. An hour passed, then two, and just as I was about to leave, he returned, looking even more distraught than before. He explained that his daughter's condition had taken a turn for the worse and that he didn't know anyone else in the area, that he felt completely alone. My heart went out to him, and I knew then that I couldn't just abandon him. I offered to stay with him, to wait until he knew more. The hours blurred together as we sat in that hospital waiting room, trading stories to pass the time, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his daughter, how she was the light of his life, how he'd never imagined he'd be sitting here, not knowing if she'd make it. I shared some stories from my own life, trying to distract him, to give him a moment of peace in the midst of his turmoil. It was close to dawn when a doctor finally came out to speak with him. I watched as his face crumbled, as he sank into a chair, the weight of the news hitting him like a physical blow. She hadn't made it. I didn't know what to say, how to offer comfort to a man who'd just lost everything. I stayed with him as he made arrangements, as he tried to come to terms with the reality of his loss. Eventually, he thanked me again, this time with tears in his eyes, and told me that he didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't been there. I went home feeling raw, my mind racing with everything that had happened, every detail etched into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been meant to help him, that fate had somehow pushed me to make that one choice, to be there for a stranger in his darkest hour. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. But I felt different, changed by that single night, by that decision to stop and help when I could have walked away. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail from the man. Inside was a small note, thanking me once again, telling me that his daughter had always believed in acts of kindness, in the idea that we're all connected, that one small act can make a world of difference. Along with the note was a check, a large sum of money he'd insisted on giving me as a token of his gratitude. I didn't want to accept it, but there was something in his words, in his belief in the goodness of people, that made me realize how deeply he'd been affected by that night. I kept the check, but instead of spending it, I used it to start a small foundation in his daughter's name, dedicated to helping people in need, to offering support in those unexpected moments when life changes in an instant. The foundation grew over time, each new person we helped becoming part of the legacy that had started with a single decision, a single choice to help someone in need. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder how different my life would be if I'd ignored that man, if I'd gone home that night and forgotten all about him. That single decision led to so much more than I could have ever imagined, to a purpose I never would have found otherwise. It changed my life in ways I can't fully explain, leaving me with a sense of connection, of meaning, that goes beyond anything I'd felt before. And all because of one choice, one moment of kindness, one night that turned into something far greater than I could have ever anticipated. The job offer that was too good to be true, my experience. The job offer that was too good to be true, my experience. It all started with an email, a simple notification about a job that seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'd been struggling to find decent work for months, the kind that paid well enough to actually cover my bills, so when this message popped up in my inbox, promising a position at an exclusive consulting firm with a six-figure salary, flexible hours, and full benefits, I was intrigued. Honestly, it sounded way too good to be true, but curiosity got the best of me, and I clicked on the link. Their website was impressive, sleek, professional, with testimonials from top-tier clients, most of whom I'd heard of. I skimmed through their mission statement, read the employee reviews, and watched a brief video of the CEO discussing the company's values and vision. The whole thing seemed legitimate. The application process was short, surprisingly so, and within hours of submitting my resume, I received a call from a woman named Vanessa who introduced herself as the HR manager. Vanessa's voice was warm and friendly, the kind of voice that immediately put you at ease. She told me that they'd reviewed my qualifications and thought I'd be an ideal fit for the role. She spoke so highly of my supposed skills that it took me a moment to realize that I hadn't actually interviewed yet. I was so flattered by her praise that I didn't think to question it. Vanessa then informed me that the job required a background check and a few preliminary tests, all standard procedure for high-level positions. She assured me they would handle everything, and all I had to do was give her my personal information, address, social security number, driver's license number, all of which I provided without hesitation. Looking back, I'm embarrassed by how easily I handed over everything, but in that moment, it felt like an opportunity I couldn't afford to lose. After the call, I received an official-looking email detailing my next steps, which included signing a non-disclosure agreement and filling out a direct deposit form so they could set up my account for payroll. They even asked for my bank account details, just to verify identity, as Vanessa put it. Again, I filled out the forms without a second thought. I was excited, and the idea of a new beginning with financial security and a prestigious job title blinded me to any potential red flags. Days passed, and I didn't hear back from Vanessa. I began to feel a bit uneasy, so I tried calling the number she'd used, only to find that it was no longer in service. When I tried visiting the website again, I was met with an error message, page not found. Panic set in, and I went through my emails, only to realize there was no way to contact the company outside of that one now defunct number and the deactivated website. I couldn't shake the growing fear in my gut, but I tried to calm myself by rationalizing that maybe it was just a technical glitch. A week later, my bank called. The representative told me there had been suspicious activity on my account, multiple withdrawals that had drained almost everything I had. My heart sank as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been scammed. Every cent I had, gone. In disbelief, I explained to the bank what had happened, but without physical proof of any wrongdoing on their end, they couldn't do much to help. All I could do was file a report with the police and hope for the best. But that wasn't the end of it. Shortly after the incident, I started receiving strange packages at my doorstep, empty boxes, random trinkets, notes with cryptic messages like "Hope you're enjoying the job and thanks for all your hard work." Each message was more unnerving than the last. My phone began buzzing with calls from unknown numbers, but whenever I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end, sometimes a faint breathing, but never a word. I was terrified, and the isolation made it worse. My friends tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a prank, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Late one night, I received an email from a familiar address, Vanessa. The subject line simply read, "Your employment status." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was blank, save for one line, "You're still on our payroll." My blood ran cold. I frantically checked my bank account, but nothing had been deposited. Instead, I found another charge, this time for something labeled employee benefits. I immediately tried to delete the email, but as soon as I did, my screen flickered, and another message appeared, this time in bold red letters, "We're watching." Paranoia took over. I started noticing strange cars parked outside my apartment, unfamiliar faces at the grocery store who seemed to be following me. I felt like I was going insane, jumping at every shadow and second-guessing everyone around me. One day, while scrolling through a forum for job scams, I stumbled upon a post that caught my eye. It detailed a story eerily similar to mine, a too-good-to-be-true job offer, a mysterious HR manager, and then, relentless harassment. The post had been written by a guy named Mark, who warned others to stay far away from companies like the one I had applied to. Mark ended his post with a cryptic line, "If you've been contacted, it's already too late." Desperate for answers, I messaged him, hoping he was still active on the forum. Days later, I received a response from Mark, but instead of answers, he only sent me a link to a hidden page. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it, and what I found was a series of profiles, each with photos and personal information, addresses, bank details, everything. Horrified, I scrolled down to find my own profile among them, along with a timestamp indicating my date of hire. The page showed dozens of other people who had fallen victim, each with their own employment status listed. Most were labeled as active, but some were listed as terminated, followed by a blank, empty space where their information used to be. My stomach churned as I realized what this meant. Frantically, I messaged Mark again, begging him to tell me what this was. This time, he responded with a single word, "Run." I packed a bag that night, leaving everything behind. I don't know who or what these people are, but I know they're still out there. They haven't stopped looking for me. Every so often, I still get emails from Vanessa, with subject lines like "Ready for your first assignment," or "Your relocation package has been approved." I've changed my number 3 times, moved cities twice, but they always find me. I live every day in fear, looking over my shoulder, knowing that no matter where I go, they're only a step behind. This isn't a job, it's a trap, a prison I can never escape. So if you ever get an offer that seems too good to be true, trust me, walk away while you still can. Because once you're in, there's no way out. I turned down a promotion and regretted it, here's why. I turned down a promotion and regretted it, here's why. It was a decision I thought I'd never make. I'd worked hard for years, climbing the ladder at the company, sacrificing weekends, late nights, even parts of my personal life just to get ahead. So when my boss finally offered me that long-awaited promotion, the one I'd been dreaming of, I shocked even myself by saying, no. It wasn't impulsive, or at least it didn't feel that way. It was months of grueling work, the stress, and this voice in my head warning me that taking on more might actually lead me further from the life I wanted. And honestly, at that moment, I'd convinced myself that my refusal was about setting boundaries, about having more time to focus on my relationship with Mia, my fiancée, and avoiding that relentless corporate grind I'd seen ruin so many lives around me. But when I told my boss, his face flashed from surprise to something I couldn't quite place, maybe disappointment or maybe something darker. Either way, he said he respected my choice and that the opportunity might still be there later, though he didn't sound convinced. The strange part was, I walked out of that meeting with a weird, unsettled feeling, like I'd made a decision that was going to echo far beyond just that room. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes, subtle at first. Meetings I used to be invited to suddenly didn't have my name on the list. Projects I'd spearheaded got shifted to other people without explanation. My boss became distant, almost cold. It wasn't anything overt, nothing you could put a finger on, but there was this sense of being slowly phased out. People I thought were allies, even friends in the office, began treating me differently, as if I was no longer part of the core team. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but then the passive-aggressive comments started, little digs about how some people aren't committed enough or might not be up for the challenge. It didn't take long to realize these were directed at me. One day, I ran into Mia after work, and when she asked how things were going, I made the mistake of telling her how much I regretted not taking the promotion. She gave me that sympathetic look but added something I didn't expect, that she was honestly relieved I hadn't accepted it. She said she missed me, missed us, and that this way, we'd have more time together, time to plan our future. I wanted to feel reassured by her words, but instead, I just felt like I was trapped between two walls that were slowly closing in, with the pressure from work on one side and Mia's expectations on the other. Then came the company-wide announcement of the new promotion candidate, Mark. I couldn't stand him, but he was technically competent, the kind of guy who did just enough to avoid trouble and somehow always ended up looking good to management. He'd only been with the company for 2 years, compared to my 5. But somehow he'd slid right into the position. The worst part was, he wasn't shy about rubbing it in, always dropping hints about his bright future and the vision he had for our team. I wanted to punch him, but I didn't. I just kept my head down, hoping to get through the awkwardness and move on. But with each passing day, the resentment ate at me, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. And I began questioning everything, from my decision to Mia's support to whether I even wanted to be at this company anymore. One evening, after Mark had once again undermined me in front of the team, I got home, looked at myself in the mirror, and realized something: I was losing myself. The person staring back at me looked defeated, not like the ambitious, determined guy I used to be. And it was terrifying because I couldn't tell if that was from my own choice or if the environment around me was doing this to me. Things hit a breaking point at the next quarterly review. My performance scores, which had always been top tier, were suddenly below average. My boss, who usually praised my work, barely looked me in the eye as he went through my review, pointing out every minor flaw and emphasizing that I'd lost my edge. By then, it was clear. My career here was effectively over unless I did something drastic. I tried reaching out to HR, explaining the situation, the subtle retaliation, the snide comments, but they told me there was little they could do without hard evidence. Maybe you should consider a fresh start, they suggested, which was HR code for "we don't care." I remember leaving that meeting feeling like I was in free fall. Mia was supportive, but even she couldn't understand the full extent of it, the frustration, the shame. It felt like my life was unraveling. My job, my stability, my sense of self, it was all slipping through my fingers because of one decision. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out Mia had been planning a wedding date behind my back, even choosing a venue. She'd decided that since I was no longer on the promotion track, I'd have more time for us. She meant well, but it felt like a slap in the face. She didn't understand that my career wasn't just a job, it was a part of who I was, a part she was casually asking me to abandon for her vision of our future. That night, we had a massive fight. I told her everything, from the retaliation at work to how I felt like a stranger in my own life. She cried, saying she didn't know things were that bad, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let her, my job, and myself down. I'd let everyone control my life, and now I was stuck in a purgatory of my own making. Desperate to regain some control, I went to my boss and told him I was ready to step up, that I wanted another chance at the promotion. He looked at me with this smug smile, like he'd known I'd come crawling back. He told me they'd already moved on, that the company was looking for people fully committed to their role. In that moment, I realized he'd never intended to give me a second chance. I was just another pawn to him, a stepping stone for Mark, a warning to others about what happens when you don't fall in line. Feeling humiliated, I walked out of his office, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel any loyalty to the company I'd sacrificed so much for. I realized I'd been clinging to an illusion, to a sense of loyalty that was never reciprocated. A week later, I handed in my resignation. The company barely reacted, and that hurt almost as much as everything else. I left without a plan, without even knowing what I wanted, just with the overwhelming need to escape. At first, I thought leaving would make me feel liberated, but instead, it felt like free falling. Job offers weren't rolling in like I'd expected. Mia and I drifted further apart, and the guilt of everything weighed on me. It was only after months of soul-searching that I found a small startup willing to take a chance on me. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was modest, and the hours were long, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark again. I had the freedom to make decisions, to learn from my mistakes, and rebuild myself on my own terms. Looking back, turning down that promotion had been the beginning of a painful journey that shattered my illusions but ultimately gave me the clarity I needed. I lost a lot, friends, stability, even my relationship with Mia, but I gained something far more valuable, the strength to start over and the wisdom to never let myself be boxed in again. If I could give advice to anyone reading this, it'd be this: sometimes, what feels like a wrong decision is just life pushing you toward the right path, no matter how painful the journey may be. The text that changed everything, a surprising confession. The text that changed everything, a surprising confession. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was late, close to midnight, and I was scrolling through my phone, half asleep, mindlessly flipping between social media apps when a text notification lit up my screen. It was from an unknown number, which immediately jolted me awake, because who sends a message at that hour without expecting a real conversation? I hesitated for a moment before clicking it open, thinking maybe it was spam or a wrong number. But the first line caught my eye: "I have something I need to tell you. You're the only person I can trust." I reread the words, trying to place the voice behind the text, as if I'd recognize someone's typing style alone. My initial instinct was to ignore it, to chalk it up to some elaborate prank, but something about the tone felt genuine, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I replied, asking, "Who is this?" Almost immediately, a response popped up: "I can't tell you who I am just yet, but I swear I'm someone you know, someone close." I stared at the screen, a chill creeping up my spine, wondering who would message me like this and why. My mind raced, thinking of friends, family, even distant acquaintances who might need to confess something, but no one fit the bill. The stranger sent another message before I could type a response: "I need you to promise not to tell anyone about this conversation. I need to get this off my chest, and you're the only one who'll understand." Curiosity gripped me, and against all logic, I typed back, "I promise." What's going on? The messages came in faster now, as if they'd been waiting for that green light. I've done something. Something bad. I never thought it would go this far, and I can't sleep at night anymore. I see it, hear it, replay it in my mind, and I don't know how to escape. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and intrigue, wondering what kind of thing this person could have done that would haunt them so intensely. Part of me wanted to stop, to ignore them and delete the messages, but another part felt drawn in, like I had to know the rest of the story. "What happened?" I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, hoping that they would keep talking, hoping I could somehow uncover their identity. The stranger continued, detailing a night that had gone horribly wrong. They described sneaking out to meet someone, sneaking back in and hearing a noise, a terrible sound that would become the soundtrack of their nightmares. They said they didn't mean to hurt anyone, but they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, that everything went wrong in ways they never could have predicted. The more I read, the more a feeling of dread began to settle over me, a strange, growing sense of familiarity, like the story was tugging at something in the back of my mind. Suddenly, they said something that made my blood run cold. "You were there that night, too." My mind froze. "Me?" I typed back, "What do you mean I was there?" They replied, "I saw you. You didn't know it, but I saw you walk by. I thought about calling out to you, but I didn't want you involved. If you'd seen me, none of this would have happened." My hands were shaking now, my mind racing back through any night that might match what they were describing, but I came up blank. I had no idea what they were talking about. I asked them to clarify, but they only replied, "It's better if you don't remember. It's safer that way." But I couldn't hold it in anymore. I couldn't keep this secret on my own. As the words sank in, I felt a surge of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. Who was this person? Why did they think I could help them? But the fear was stronger than any anger, fear that whatever they'd done, whatever they thought I might know, could somehow ruin my life, too. My fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to call the police, or to call someone, anyone, who might understand. But before I could make a decision, another message popped up. "You think I'm a monster, don't you?" I didn't know what to say. I was trapped in their confession, an unwilling participant in whatever dark secret they were carrying, and it felt like a nightmare that I couldn't escape from. Instead of replying, I stayed silent, hoping they'd stop, but they didn't. The stranger went on, describing in chilling detail how they tried to cover up what had happened, how they'd planned to leave it all behind but couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. And then, the confession took a darker turn. They admitted that they'd started to think someone was following them, that they felt like they were being watched. They said they couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if someone knew what they'd done. At this point, my heart was pounding, my thoughts racing between horror and suspicion, wondering if this was some kind of sick joke. But it felt too real, too raw to be fake. I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole, getting sucked deeper into a confession I'd never asked for. I typed, "Why are you telling me all of this?" The reply came almost immediately, "Because if anything happens to me, I need someone to know the truth. And if I don't make it, I need you to tell them I'm sorry." That last sentence sent a shiver down my spine. I typed back, "What do you mean, if you don't make it?" The response was cryptic, just 3 words that made my heart skip a beat: "It's too late." Then, the messages stopped. I waited, watching the screen for more, but nothing came. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail, the hollow sound of the beep echoing in my ears, leaving me with nothing but my own racing thoughts. I barely slept that night, my mind spinning with questions, trying to piece together fragments of the story, trying to figure out who this person was, what they'd done, and what it had to do with me. In the morning, I considered going to the police, but what would I even tell them? That someone I didn't know had sent me a cryptic confession and then vanished? It sounded insane. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, that maybe they were really gone, and I was the last person who knew their secret. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing more. But every now and then, I'd get an eerie feeling, like someone was watching me, like I'd become part of something dark and sinister that I couldn't escape from. Then, one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number lit up my screen. Heart pounding, I opened it, expecting more cryptic words, maybe an explanation, but instead, it was just one line: "You should have kept your promise." I sat there, frozen, my mind reeling, wondering what that meant, wondering if it was the same person or someone else who knew what I'd been told. In the days that followed, I found myself looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was always a step behind me. The confession that I'd been dragged into had become a shadow over my life, a constant reminder that somewhere out there, someone had trusted me with a terrible truth, and now, that trust was haunting me. And every time I looked at my phone, I half expected another message, a chilling reminder that the secret I'd tried to forget was still out there, lurking, waiting to pull me back in. The strange encounter that changed my view on life. The strange encounter that changed my view on life. It all began on a night like any other, one of those evenings where the weight of a long day pressed heavy on my shoulders, and all I wanted was the comfort of my bed. The drive home was uneventful until I decided to take a detour, one that cut through the edge of the woods lining the outskirts of town. It was an old habit from my high school days, driving that winding, desolate road just to feel a bit of solitude and peace. The sky was clear, with the moon casting pale silver shadows across the forest, making everything seem sharper, more defined. I turned down my music to hear the soothing hum of the car engine, when suddenly, out of nowhere, the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my headlights illuminated a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, and came to a skidding stop just feet away from them. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The figure didn't flinch or step back, just stood there, staring at me. My headlights revealed a man in a black coat, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. There was something unsettling about him, an aura that seemed to make the night itself colder. I lowered the window a crack, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out, my voice more unsteady than I'd like to admit. The man slowly lifted his head, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's, gleaming with an unnatural luminescence. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out of there, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. He finally spoke, his voice soft and oddly melodic, a tone that seemed to vibrate deep in my chest. "You've come to a crossroads," he said, his words hanging in the air with an eerie resonance. "Tonight, you must choose." I stared at him, confused and terrified. "Choose what?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The air around us felt thick, oppressive, and the silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear my own rapid heartbeat. He took a step closer, and the world seemed to tilt, the forest around us warping and blurring as if I were suddenly seeing everything through the bottom of a glass. My car felt like a fragile bubble of safety, but it also felt like a cage, trapping me there in that moment. The man lifted one gloved hand and pointed to the woods on my left. "That path leads to knowledge," he said. Then he turned and gestured to the road ahead, the one that led home. "This path leads to peace." A chill ran down my spine, and I found myself shaking my head. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He dropped his hand, and I felt a sudden wave of clarity, as if he had somehow unlocked something in my mind. Images began to flash before me, not memories, but glimpses of possibilities. I saw myself years from now, leading a simple, happy life, filled with warmth and family and laughter. Then I saw an alternate path, one where I was consumed by a relentless search for answers, driven to understand things that no human should ever know. The man was offering me a choice, a future shaped by knowledge or one shaped by peace. It felt absurd, unreal, but every fiber of my being knew this was real, that this choice would shape the rest of my life. "Why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. The man's glowing eyes met mine, and there was something almost sorrowful in his gaze. "Because you are at the crossroads," he said simply. My mind spun, torn between the promises each path seemed to hold. Knowledge had always been something I craved. I wanted to know the secrets of the universe, to unravel the mysteries that plagued humanity. But peace, the thought of a life unburdened by questions I couldn't answer, was alluring in a way I hadn't expected. As I sat there, struggling with my decision, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Time felt suspended, waiting for me to act. Finally, I made my choice. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest, and told him what I wanted. The man nodded once, solemnly, as if he already knew. "It is done," he said, and then he was gone. No flash of light, no puff of smoke, just gone, as if he had never been there at all. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifted, and I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I took a shuddering breath and looked around. The road was empty, and the forest was just a forest again, quiet and still under the moonlight. I drove home in a daze, the encounter playing over and over in my mind. For days, I wondered if it had really happened or if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, strange things began to happen. If I had chosen knowledge, I found myself haunted by truths that no one else could see, plagued by visions and realizations that made the world seem darker, more complex than I ever could have imagined. If I had chosen peace, I found a sudden calm settling into my life, opportunities falling into place effortlessly, a gentle sense of purpose guiding me. I realized that whichever path I had chosen was now shaping my reality, and there was no going back. The encounter had changed me, left me with a sense that the world was far more mysterious than I had ever imagined. I'd been given a glimpse of the power of choice, the impact of a single moment, and it left me humbled, grateful, and, at times, terrified. I'll never forget that strange encounter, the man with eyes that shone like stars, and the crossroads that forever altered the course of my life. It made me question everything I thought I knew and filled me with a deep respect for the unknown, for the choices we make, and for the paths we walk, whether we understand them or not. My surprise encounter with a celebrity, what they were really like. My surprise encounter with a celebrity, what they were really like. The story of my surreal encounter begins on an average Thursday afternoon when I found myself doing something I absolutely despised, grocery shopping. I'd procrastinated all week, and the contents of my fridge had dwindled to a depressing jar of pickles and a carton of milk that was probably on the verge of mutiny. The local supermarket was a fluorescent-lit nightmare, filled with squeaky-wheeled carts, the cry of a distant baby in the cereal aisle, and the Muzak version of Sweet Caroline looping endlessly through the overhead speakers. I was standing in the produce section, inspecting a pile of suspiciously shiny apples, when the atmosphere around me shifted. You know that feeling you get when someone important walks into a room? It was like that, a collective ripple of excitement and tension that made me turn my head. At first, I didn't believe my eyes. There, standing a few feet away from me, casually examining a bunch of bananas, was none other than A-lister Liam Harper. Yes, the Liam Harper, the action star whose movies I'd binge-watched countless times, whose face was plastered across billboards, and who, to my knowledge, had no business being in a small, middle-of-nowhere town like mine. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, dark sunglasses that couldn't quite hide his chiseled jawline, and a simple hoodie that seemed woefully inadequate for disguising his celebrity status. My brain short-circuited. Celebrities didn't just waltz into supermarkets to casually pick fruit, right? But there he was, in the flesh, and no amount of rationalizing could convince me otherwise. A few other shoppers had noticed him, too, and the whispers started immediately. Despite the excitement crackling in the air, Liam looked calm, almost detached, as if he were trying to blend in with the rest of us mere mortals. I stood frozen, clutching a plastic bag of Granny Smiths like an idiot, debating whether I should approach him. I wasn't a fangirl, okay, maybe a little, but the idea of actually speaking to someone I'd only seen on the big screen made my heart race. Before I could make a decision, something bizarre happened. A little boy, probably no older than 6, stumbled into the produce section, looking lost and terrified. His wide, tear-filled eyes darted around, and he was sniffling so hard I thought he might hyperventilate. No one else seemed to notice him, too absorbed in whispering about Liam or preoccupied with their grocery lists. But Liam noticed. His posture changed instantly, his casual nonchalance replaced with a laser-focused intensity. He dropped the bunch of bananas he was holding and crossed the distance to the boy in 3 long strides. "Hey, buddy," he said, kneeling so he was eye level with the kid. His voice, usually deep and commanding in his films, softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "Are you lost?" The boy nodded, hiccuping on a sob. Liam's sunglasses slipped down his nose as he offered a reassuring smile. "It's okay. We'll find your parents, all right?" I watched, mesmerized, as he gently took the boy's hand and stood, glancing around for someone who might be frantically searching for their missing child. His calm demeanor and genuine concern were so different from the cocky, invincible characters he played in movies. In that moment, he was just a decent human being helping a scared kid. My gut twisted with something like admiration, mixed with disbelief. As Liam guided the boy toward the customer service desk, a woman came rushing into the aisle, her face pale with worry. She spotted her son, and relief flooded her features. "Oh my God, there you are," she exclaimed, dropping to her knees and wrapping the boy in a tight hug. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she mouthed a heartfelt thank you to Liam. He nodded, stepping back to give them space, but I noticed the way his jaw clenched, like he was bracing himself for something. And then it happened. The woman's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Wait. You're Liam Harper?" She stammered, her voice rising in pitch. The boy pulled back from his mother's embrace, also realizing who had just helped him. The whispers and murmurs intensified, and I saw the walls closing in around Liam, the way the celebrity spotlight had found him despite his best efforts to remain anonymous. A group of teenagers, phones at the ready, started inching closer, and the poor guy looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It was the kind of vulnerability you don't expect to see in someone who always seemed larger than life. Instinctively, I did something completely out of character for me. I marched forward, abandoning my apples, and inserted myself between Liam and the crowd of curious onlookers. "All right, everyone, give the man some space," I said, trying to sound authoritative, even though my voice cracked a little. "He's just here to buy groceries like the rest of us." For a moment, I thought I'd made a huge mistake. People stared at me, and I felt the heat rise to my face, but miraculously, they seemed to hesitate. The woman with the little boy took the opportunity to thank Liam again and whisked her son away, leaving him looking equal parts grateful and overwhelmed. Liam's eyes met mine, and he flashed a small, grateful smile, the kind that made me wonder how many times he'd had to put on a brave face in situations like this. The crowd began to disperse, and Liam turned to me, sliding his sunglasses back into place. "Thanks for that," he said, his voice low but sincere. My heart was still hammering, and I had to force myself to breathe normally. "No problem," I replied, my voice steadier now. "I figured you probably get enough of that in Hollywood," he chuckled, the sound so warm and genuine that it melted the last of my nerves. "Yeah, you'd be surprised," he said. There was a beat of silence, and I realized this was my chance to actually have a normal conversation with him. But what do you say to someone whose face has been on magazine covers and blockbuster movie posters? Before I could overthink it, Liam glanced at my abandoned bag of apples and raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not going to buy those?" I felt myself blush, embarrassed that he'd noticed. "Oh, right. Guess I got a little distracted." He grinned, and for a moment, he wasn't a celebrity, just a guy making a joke in a grocery store. "Well, thanks again," he said, his expression turning serious. It's rare to meet someone who'll actually stand up and help, especially when things get weird. I shrugged, feeling a mix of pride and disbelief. "I just did what anyone would do," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Liam gave me a look that said he knew better. We stood there for another awkward moment, and then, just like that, he was gone, disappearing down the snack aisle like a ghost. I watched him go, half expecting to wake up and find out the whole thing had been a bizarre dream. But it wasn't. I left the store in a daze, clutching my bag of groceries and wondering if anyone would believe me if I told them what had happened. But the strangest thing was, I didn't want to tell anyone. The encounter felt too personal, too surreal, like a secret moment I'd been lucky enough to witness. The tabloids and fans could have their stories and their gossip, but I'd seen the real Liam Harper, the one who cared enough to comfort a crying child and who appreciated a stranger's help when the world closed in. The experience left me with a renewed respect for the people behind the fame, the ones who, despite their larger-than-life personas, were still human. It was a lesson I hadn't expected to learn on a random Thursday afternoon, but one I'd never forget. The strangest thing I found in my new apartment. Moving into a new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, a blank slate after the chaotic end to my last relationship and the seemingly endless series of unlucky events that had plagued me. I had spent weeks searching, picking through all the usual listings, and finally found something affordable in an old brick building at the edge of the city. It was small, but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and windows that looked out over the busy street below. It had that old, lived-in feel, but nothing about it screamed "stay away." I spent the first day just unpacking, listening to music, trying to make the space feel like my own. But it was that night, once the last box was broken down and the silence settled in, that I noticed something strange. The air felt thick, almost charged, and there was a faint but distinct smell, like musty books or something forgotten for too long. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the quirks of an old building. But when I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth, I noticed something unusual, a small metal latch, low to the ground, barely noticeable unless you were kneeling down. I knelt, curious, and gently lifted the latch, discovering a small, square hatch set into the wall. It was hidden just under the sink, blending in with the aging tile. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling a slight shiver as I looked at it. I couldn't imagine why a bathroom would need an access panel so small and so hidden, but maybe it was an old crawl space or an access point for pipes. Still, something about it seemed off. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled on the tiny handle, which gave way surprisingly easily. The hatch swung open to reveal a narrow, dark passage that seemed to lead down between the walls. I couldn't see much beyond the first few feet, but I could hear a faint dripping sound echoing up from somewhere far below. My first instinct was to close it back up, forget I'd seen it, and call it a weird old building quirk. But that eerie curiosity pulled at me, the kind of curiosity that makes you do something even when you know you probably shouldn't. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and knelt down to peer inside. The beam of light revealed a cramped, dusty crawl space with walls covered in strange, faint marks, as though someone had scratched symbols or drawings into the plaster long ago. They looked like abstract figures, almost childlike, but there was a disturbing edge to them, something that made my stomach twist as I shined the light down further. The air grew colder, and that strange smell became more intense, like dampness mixed with something metallic. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling, like the sound of something shifting in the dark. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to back away, but I stayed, staring into the shadows as the rustling grew louder, closer. My hand shook as I kept the flashlight steady, and that's when I saw it, a small bundle, wrapped tightly in what looked like old cloth, tucked just out of reach. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and pulled it closer. The bundle was heavier than I expected, and the cloth had a strange, sticky texture that clung to my skin, leaving a faint, dark residue. Heart pounding, I unwrapped it slowly, revealing an old, leather-bound notebook, battered and worn with age. The cover was blank, but the pages inside were filled with spidery handwriting, cramped and frantic. Most of it was incoherent rambling, words that made no sense, references to things I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through, I found drawings, grotesque sketches of faces twisted in agony, figures with hollow eyes staring out from the page. My skin crawled as I looked at them, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. On the last page, in bold, uneven letters, were the words "Do not look in the walls." I slammed the book shut, heart racing, as a sense of unease settled over me. What had I stumbled into? My apartment suddenly felt wrong, as though I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I shoved the book back into the bundle, closed the hatch, and tried to forget about it, but that night, I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, and I kept imagining those twisted faces, those hollow eyes staring back at me. Over the next few days, I tried to go on as normal, but strange things kept happening. Objects would move on their own, lights flickered unpredictably, and that smell lingered, no matter how much I cleaned. Once, I heard faint scratching coming from the walls, like something alive was trapped just out of sight. Desperate for answers, I asked the building manager about the history of the apartment, but he just shrugged, saying it was one of the oldest units and that no one had lived there long, most people moving out within a few months. He said it with an odd smile, almost as though he knew something he wasn't telling me. I considered leaving, but something kept me there, a strange pull I couldn't explain, as though the apartment itself had a hold on me. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping from within the walls, almost like a heartbeat. It grew louder, faster, until it seemed to echo in my skull, and I bolted upright, my pulse racing. In a trance, I found myself drawn back to that hatch, my hand reaching for the latch almost against my will. I opened it, shined my flashlight down, and there, further down the crawl space, I saw something move, a figure, hunched and twisted, with hollow eyes that stared back at me, watching, waiting. I slammed the hatch shut, heart pounding, and fled the apartment that night, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what I found in that crawl space or what was waiting for me in the walls, but I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the twisted faces in that notebook, the words scrawled in frantic desperation. And I know, deep down, that some things are meant to stay hidden, buried in the dark, beyond our reach. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. When I first got Chester, a scrappy little terrier mix with a knack for finding trouble, I had no idea how much my life was going to change. Chester was supposed to be a companion, something to keep me company in my small, creaky apartment. But it turned out that Chester was much more than a loyal pet, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was quirky, with an intense look in his eyes that always seemed to know more than he let on. He had this way of staring at me like he was trying to communicate something I could never quite understand, like there was a secret he was desperate to share. I never thought much of it until that day, the day I realized Chester had been trying to teach me something all along. It started out like any other morning, the soft light creeping in through the window, illuminating the dust in the air, the quiet hum of the city outside. Chester was unusually restless, pacing around the room, sniffing the air with a strange intensity. I figured he'd heard something, a car backfiring, someone moving furniture in the apartment next door, but the way he looked at me was different. There was urgency in his eyes, almost a sense of fear, like he was trying to tell me something was wrong. I brushed it off, distracted by my own morning routine. But Chester wouldn't let up. He kept pacing, barking in short, sharp bursts that echoed through the quiet apartment. I knelt down, tried to calm him, but he was inconsolable, pulling at the hem of my pants with his teeth, tugging me toward the door with more force than I'd ever seen in him before. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about it, something in the way he wouldn't look away, his eyes wide and pleading. All right, I sighed, grabbing his leash. Maybe he just needed some fresh air, I thought. I opened the door, and he shot out into the hallway, his little paws echoing on the floor, his body tense and ready. But as I followed him outside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, unnaturally quiet for this time of day. There was an eerie stillness, the usual bustle and noise gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Chester tugged me down the street, pulling with a determination that I'd never seen before, guiding me down alleyways and side streets that I'd never taken. My heart started to race as I realized we were heading toward the old abandoned house at the edge of town, the one everyone said was haunted, the one parents warned their kids about. I'd never been near it before, never had a reason to, but now Chester seemed intent on leading me there, his nose low to the ground, his tail held high like he was on a mission. We reached the house, its windows dark and empty, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. Chester scratched at the door, whimpering softly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to take him home, but something held me there, some unspoken bond between us that compelled me to trust him. I opened the door, the old wood creaking beneath my fingers, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging heavy in the air. Chester led me through the dark, empty rooms, his paws silent on the floorboards as he guided me deeper into the house. I felt a growing unease, a sense of dread that built with each step, but I couldn't stop. Chester was on a mission, and I was trapped in his wake, following him down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, we reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred and battered, like someone had tried to claw their way through. Chester stopped, his eyes fixed on the door, his body tense and alert. He turned to me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a warning, a plea. I swallowed, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room, empty except for a single, old chair in the center. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Chester stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the chair, and I realized he was trembling, his body tense with fear. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible, sitting in the chair, its head tilted toward us in a silent, unseeing gaze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, feel its cold, empty gaze boring into me. Chester let out a low growl, his hackles raised, his body pressed against my leg as if to protect me. I didn't understand, didn't know what he was trying to tell me, but I could feel his fear, feel his desperation to get me out of that room. I turned to leave, pulling Chester with me, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard a voice, soft and whispery, like the wind passing through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and I felt a chill settle over me, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I ran, pulling Chester along with me, my heart racing as we stumbled down the stairs and out into the blinding light of day. I didn't stop until we were back at home, safe within the familiar walls of our apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside a comforting reminder of normalcy. But Chester was different, quieter, more subdued. He didn't look at me the same way, didn't have that playful spark in his eyes. It was like something had changed between us, like he'd seen something I couldn't understand, something he could never unsee. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could feel that cold gaze, that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. Chester stayed close to me, always watching, always alert, as if he knew that something had followed us back, something that was waiting, lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room, something I couldn't see. He let out a low growl, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows and silence. Chester looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't explain, a sadness that seemed to say goodbye. The next morning, he was gone. I searched everywhere, calling his name, tearing the apartment apart in a desperate frenzy, but he was nowhere to be found. It was like he'd vanished, like he'd been taken by something I couldn't understand. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, tried to accept that Chester was gone. But every night, I could feel that cold presence, feel that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. And every night, I wondered if he'd left to protect me, if he'd sacrificed himself to keep me safe from something I couldn't see, something I couldn't fight. I don't know where he is, don't know if he's still out there, watching over me from some place beyond my understanding. But I know that he taught me an important lesson that day, that there are things in this world that we can't see, things that linger in the shadows, waiting, watching, and that sometimes, the ones we love will do anything to protect us from the darkness, even if it means leaving us behind. I found a hidden letter from my late grandparent, it changed my life. I found a hidden letter from my late grandparent, it changed my life. It began on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day that makes the world feel golden, when I found myself back at my grandparents' old house. My grandfather had passed away 6 months ago, and the house had sat untouched, frozen in time, while my family figured out what to do with it. That day, I had been tasked with clearing out his study, a room I had always been fascinated by as a child. It was a place filled with old books, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and a lingering scent of pipe tobacco. As I sorted through the dusty relics of a life well lived, I stumbled upon an antique writing desk tucked into the far corner of the room. The desk, with its ornate carvings and brass handles, had been my grandfather's pride and joy, but I had never once seen it open. Curiosity got the best of me, and I began searching for a way to unlock its mysteries. After fumbling for a while, I discovered a hidden latch underneath one of the drawers. With a satisfying click, the drawer slid open, revealing a pile of old letters wrapped in twine. My heart raced as I carefully unwrapped them, but it was the letter at the bottom of the stack that caught my attention. The envelope was marked with my name, written in my grandfather's unmistakable, looping handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore open the letter. It read, "To my dearest grandchild, if you are reading this, I am no longer there to share in your joys and sorrows, but there are things I must tell you, secrets that I could never share while I was alive." My eyes widened, and I read on, the letter unfolding a story that felt too strange to be real. My grandfather confessed that he had been part of a secret society, one dedicated to guarding an ancient artifact that held powers humanity was never meant to wield. This artifact, he claimed, had the ability to alter reality itself, and it had been hidden in our family's possession for generations. My first reaction was to laugh. It had to be some kind of elaborate joke, a posthumous prank from a man who loved riddles and stories. But the more I read, the more convinced I became that my grandfather believed every word he had written. He described how the artifact had been hidden in the very house I now stood in, and how its power had been the cause of inexplicable events throughout our family's history, the near-miraculous recoveries from illnesses, the strange bursts of luck, the eerie visions seen by those who had lived there. My grandfather had spent his life ensuring the artifact remained hidden, but he feared that his death would bring danger, that someone might come looking for it. He wrote that he had left clues throughout the house, a puzzle meant only for me, his beloved grandchild, to solve. "Find it, protect it," the letter ended. "And be careful, for you are not the only one searching." The air felt thick with tension as I folded the letter, my mind spinning with disbelief and excitement. I didn't know whether to dismiss the whole thing as the ramblings of a man with an overactive imagination or to take it seriously. My choice was made for me when, that very night, strange things began to happen. It started with the shadows. As I moved through the house, sorting more of my grandfather's belongings, I noticed them shifting in ways that defied logic. Once, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the hallway, only to find it empty when I rushed to check. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then, things began to move. A family portrait fell from the wall with a deafening crash, even though it had been securely hung. Doors creaked open and shut of their own accord, and the once comforting house began to feel like a labyrinth of secrets. Determined to see this through, I remembered the clues my grandfather had mentioned. The first one was hidden in his collection of old maps, a detail mentioned in the letter. I spent hours combing through the maps until I found a small, faded symbol that didn't belong. It led me to the fireplace, where I discovered a loose brick that concealed a tiny wooden box. Inside the box was another letter, this one even more cryptic. It spoke of a guardian who watched over the artifact, someone who would stop at nothing to ensure its power remained untouched. I shivered, the weight of the letter pressing on me like a physical force. I barely had time to process this when a loud bang echoed through the house. Heart pounding, I rushed to the source and found the back door wide open, swaying on its hinges. I was certain I had locked it. I closed and bolted it, but a chill ran down my spine. Was someone else here, searching for the artifact just as my grandfather had warned? The next clue was hidden in the attic, a place I had always dreaded going. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the creaky stairs, every step making my pulse race. The attic was filled with old furniture and boxes covered in decades of dust. I nearly screamed when something scurried past my feet, but it was only a mouse. Taking a deep breath, I remembered my grandfather's instructions and began looking for anything out of place. Hours passed before I found it, an old trunk with a combination lock. The numbers were tied to the date of my grandparents' wedding, and when I entered them, the trunk popped open. Inside was a small, velvet-lined case and another letter. I opened the case to find a strange, metallic object that pulsed with an unnatural warmth. The artifact. It was real. But before I could examine it further, a sound like a whispering wind filled the attic, and I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. Slowly turning around, I saw a shadow detach itself from the darkness. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by the gloom. His voice was low and almost gentle. "I've been waiting for you," he said. My breath caught in my throat, and I clutched the artifact to my chest. He stepped closer, and I could see his eyes now, pale and unblinking. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," he whispered. I didn't know where the courage came from, but I managed to say, "It belongs to my family. I won't let you take it." The man's expression didn't change, but I could feel the pressure of his presence growing, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Just as I thought I couldn't withstand it any longer, the artifact in my hands began to glow, a brilliant light that chased away the shadows. The man recoiled, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. He vanished, leaving only the echo of his threat hanging in the air. Shaken, I stumbled down from the attic, clutching the artifact and the letters. My grandfather had been right. This was more than just a family secret, it was a legacy, a responsibility. And I knew that my life would never be the same again. I had no idea what dangers still lurked, but one thing was certain: I would honor my grandfather's wishes, protect the artifact, and uncover the truth about the guardian who had almost claimed it. The house felt alive with secrets, and I realized that my journey was just beginning.